This man was the top player in the entire server, a gaming god. He was also a sharp-tongued, salty, yet ultimately righteous techie. Today, this player, who never took on apprentices, unexpectedly accepted a ridiculously lucky newbie. However, during their first encounter, the gaming god, without a word of explanation, pushed his new apprentice off a cliff. But who could have predicted that the apprentice's fall would trigger a hidden Easter egg? The newbie unexpectedly scored a divine beast as a mount, and this clueless apprentice, mistaking the mount for a welcome gift from his master, was moved to tears. This was a relatively realistic, virtual reality, immersive, ancient-style game. In this game, players could role-play as renowned heroes. They could also play as wealthy merchants, amassing fortunes within the game and reaching the pinnacle of life. Or they could simply retire within the game, becoming carefree travelers exploring the world. Any regrets left unfulfilled in reality could be addressed in this virtual world. And Mengxing Luosa, playing an assassin in this game, was currently a level 66 noob. So, even when he was being ripped off, he was completely oblivious. His level 80 friend, Zhen Bufu, could only repeatedly try to explain that the weapon Luosa possessed was practically worthless. But Luosa remained unconvinced, urging his friend to take a closer look at the oddly shaped weapon, assuming Zhen Bufu simply didn't recognize its value. Zhen Bufu was utterly speechless. He tried to explain to Luosa that originally this dagger had some market value, but because of its unique, somewhat suggestive shape, it had been nicknamed the But Dagger, and now everyone considered it bad luck. So, even if Luosa offered to pay someone 200 taels to take it, he'd have no takers. Hearing this, Luosa was stunned. But then, Zhen Bufu noticed the gem on the dagger. He thought this gem was relatively rare and could fetch a few hundred taels. He patted Luosa's head, reassuring him not to worry too much. It seemed the seller still had a shred of conscience, leaving him a high-level gem. However, Zhen Bufu's next words rendered him speechless once again. The gem was Luosa's own. Furious at being scammed, Luosa slammed his fists on the table. The dagger had been sold to him by the guild leader. Just as he was about to confront the leader, he was kicked out of the guild. Seeing this, Zhen Bufu suggested he find a master to protect him. That way, he wouldn't be bullied anymore. But Luosa, who had never had a master, hesitated. He had reached level 66 without ever having a mentor. So, Zhen Bufu pulled out the weapon his master had crafted for him and began extolling the virtues of having a master. If Luosa found a good master, he could learn a lot about the game. A master could not only help him fight monsters, but also protect him in times of danger. Having someone guide him in the game would help him avoid many pitfalls, preventing situations like being scammed. Luosa found Zhen Bufu's words convincing. Filled with hope, he decided to seek a master. A woman's intuition told him that the master he was looking for had some inexplicable connection to him, giving him a strange sense of peace. However, the characters that appeared on the apprenticeship page the next moment left him speechless. The characters on his apprenticeship homepage were either missing noses and eyes, or were hideously ugly men with bright red lipstick. Zhen Bufu consoled him, explaining that there were no set appearances in the game, so players could customize their faces however they liked. He told Luosa to take his time and choose a master he liked. He, meanwhile, had to go run a dungeon with a friend. Just then, Luosa's attention was caught by an offline player named Ija. Thinking about the potential 10% discount on future purchases, Luosa considered for a moment before sending Ija an apprenticeship request. Seeing that it was already the middle of the night, he decided it was time to get some rest. He removed the game sensor. In real life, the woman, just like her game character, had green hair. She was a university art teacher. After washing up and lying in bed, Luosa still couldn't shake his anger. The memory of being scammed by the guild leader kept him awake. He silently vowed to seek revenge once he became stronger. He hoped that when he logged in tomorrow, he would successfully become an apprentice and finally have someone to back him up. As he drifted off, he recalled his potential master's character image. Luosa felt that this level 100 player must be a very gentle person. The scene changed to the next day. A man named and hung, with a gloomy expression, stared blankly at the penalty for dissolving a master-disciple relationship. 5 minutes earlier, upon putting on his sensor and logging in, he had received an apprenticeship request. He thought he had turned off the apprentice function. He was about to click decline when his ginger cat suddenly meowed and pounced on him, landing squarely on his chest. The cat's sudden intrusion caused Hung to lurch in real life. Following this, his in-game character mirrored his action, clicking the confirmation button. In the next second, the apprenticeship was successfully established. Seeing the system notification, Hung cursed the cat while simultaneously brainstorming ways to get rid of this new disciple. He discovered that if a master wanted to unilaterally dissolve the master-disciple relationship, they had to pay a hefty fine. Only if the disciple initiated the termination would there be no penalty. And Heng's mind raced, quickly devising a plan. In the next instant, he summoned Luosa. On the other side, Luosa indeed received the summons from his new master. He was overjoyed, surprised by his success in securing the apprenticeship. To show his sincerity, he immediately sent Heng 360 enthusiastic messages of well wishes. However, Hung didn't reply, instead sending a cold, impersonal summon request. Without a second thought, Luosa accepted, instantly vanishing from his current location. With a flash of blue light, he arrived at the place Hung had summoned him. Below him was a sheer cliff, a fatal drop. Luosa steadied himself, appearing before Hung, his heart brimming with excitement. He looked up at his master, eyes shining, a joyous expression practically bursting from the screen. The man before him, dressed as a swordsman, was incredibly handsome and seemed remarkably kind. The more Luosa looked, the happier he became. This master was exactly as he had imagined. Lost in thought, he blurted out a stream of flattering compliments. But before he could finish, the man suddenly reached out and shoved him off the cliff. The unsuspecting Luosa had no idea what had just happened. The master who moments before seemed so gentle now wore a sinister smirk. Less than a minute into his apprenticeship, his new master had personally pushed him to his doom. Plunging downwards, Luosa was utterly bewildered, struggling to comprehend the situation. He looked back at the man still standing on the cliff edge. The man's expression was unreadable, his indifference suggesting premeditation. He even waved goodbye. Luosa, oblivious to Heng's scheme, was too far away to hear what the man said. But then a new thought struck him. None of it mattered now. He was about to die. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable impact at the bottom, hoping it wouldn't be too painful. Just as he resigned himself to his fate, a bird's cry startled him. He looked up curiously toward the sky. A phoenix with ashen wings appeared, flying towards him, radiating a dazzling light. Its magnificent feathers shimmered with gold, so bright that Luosa had to shield his eyes. But this beautiful phoenix appeared to Luosa as a long-tailed sun monster. He cried out in terror. In the next moment, the divine phoenix swooped down, catching him and preventing his certain death. Simultaneously, a system message announced that he had successfully formed a spiritual bond with the divine beast. Luosa was completely dumbfounded. His fall had triggered a hidden game event, Nirvana Rebirth, granting him a phoenix mount. In Luosa's mind, this phoenix was a gift intentionally arranged by Hung, a welcoming present from his master. Overwhelmed with gratitude, he assumed that this was the message Hung had tried to convey before he fell. Meanwhile, back on the cliff, Hung breathed a sigh of relief. He believed that after this ordeal, Luosa would be furious and initiate the termination of their apprenticeship. This way, he wouldn't have to pay the penalty. As he congratulated himself on his clever plan, a server-wide announcement echoed through the game, congratulating the player Sasa Edian O for triggering a hidden event and obtaining a divine beast. The name sounded vaguely familiar. As he pondered who it could be, a voice called out from behind him, shouting, "Master!" Hung spun around. There, riding on the back of the phoenix, was Luosa, waving cheerfully. Staring at the circling phoenix and his beaming disciple, Hung was speechless. Luosa continued to greet him enthusiastically, calling him master with saccharine sweetness. His gaze, filled with gratitude and delight, conveyed his belief in Heng's incredible generosity. He remained completely oblivious to the dumbfounded expression on Heng's face. Hung turned and walked away, Luosa hot on his heels, thanking him profusely for pushing him off the cliff, which had led to him acquiring the divine mount. Heng's face darkened. Luosa then asked Hung to help him become stronger. Hung, perplexed, wondered what this enthusiastic disciple planned to do with newfound power. It turned out Luosa's desperation stemmed from being swindled out of 2,000 taels by his unscrupulous guild leader just yesterday. His drive for power was purely for revenge. And Hung, however, found this explanation even more exasperating. The kid had already been scammed once, yet knowing En Hung had shoved him off a cliff, he still dared to seek him out as a master. What a fool. And Hung decided he had to get rid of this foolish apprentice immediately. There was no time to waste. He couldn't have such a weakling clinging to him. He reached out to his close friends, hoping one of them would take Luosa off his hands, but they were all conveniently unavailable. Meanwhile, his foolish apprentice had been bombarding him with messages for the past half hour. Unable to bear it any longer, and Hung relented and took Luosa into a high-difficulty dungeon, hoping to find an opportunity to ditch him. To his surprise, the rewards Luosa received kept getting better and better. At this point, En Hung had to admit that this apprentice he'd accidentally taken on seemed to possess an outrageous amount of luck, a luck so potent that En Hung couldn't shake him off even if he tried. Still in disbelief, En Hung brought Luosa to the wolf's lair, an even more challenging dungeon. The moment they arrived at the entrance, he impatiently shoved Luosa inside. But Luosa grabbed his hand, insisting they enter together. He didn't want to hoard all the rewards for himself. As they tugged back and forth, an unusual sound echoed from within the dungeon. Sensing the dungeon was about to collapse, En Hung, without a second thought, grabbed Luosa's wrist. He instinctively saved the boy's life, even as he questioned his own actions. Hadn't that been the perfect opportunity to get rid of him? But now he'd gone and saved him. There was nothing to be done. Behind him, Luosa was overflowing with gratitude, praising En Hung as the best master in the world. After they escaped, they discovered another level beneath the collapsed cavern. Luosa suggested they explore it, but En Hung, convinced they would fall to their deaths, immediately refused. Luosa, however, thought it was no big deal, a simple task for him. He summoned his phoenix. With a whoosh, a single feather shimmered in the air. In the next moment, both Luosa and En Hung were riding on the phoenix's back, descending into the lower level of the cavern. En Hung felt a flicker of relief. Perhaps this foolish apprentice wasn't as weak as he thought. He could handle himself, after all. They soon reached the bottom. Looking around at the unfamiliar surroundings and the abstract dragon head painted on the wall, En Hung was puzzled. He didn't remember this area from his previous visits to the dungeon. He warned his foolish apprentice that the place seemed strange and advised him not to touch anything suspicious, lest he trigger a trap. But before he could finish, Luosa had already placed a clump of grass on the dragon's head, simply because he thought the bare head looked pitiful. As expected, the dragon head, now adorned with the grass, sprang to life. A dragon with an extravagant, spiky hairstyle emerged, declaring that after 1,000 years, someone had finally found the grass imbued with his soul, allowing him to awaken. En Hung was utterly speechless. It would take someone with the strategic mind of a 10-year-old to solve that puzzle. Because Luosa had awakened him, the flamboyant dragon considered him his destined benefactor. As a reward, he decided to unlock a hidden raid, the dragon's treasure, for Luosa. Since Luosa's level was too low, the dragon also gifted him a 2-person dungeon, instructing him to return for the raid once he was strong enough. Just like that, the incredibly lucky Luosa had stumbled upon 2 hidden instances. A system announcement rang out across the game. Other players, seeing Luosa trigger 2 hidden instances at once, were green with envy. Confused by the sudden surge of attention, Luosa asked his master why the hidden raid was causing such a commotion. En Hung, a seasoned veteran and perpetually unlucky player, didn't respond, his expression a mask of despair. The chance of triggering a world hidden raid was a mere 0.0001%. Yet this foolish apprentice had managed to do it. By now, Luosa's friend requests had reached 99+. Completely bewildered, he turned to En Hung for an explanation. En Hung, exasperated, explained that hidden raids offered the most lucrative rewards and were incredibly rare. Everyone wanted in. Realizing the significance of this, Luosa immediately invited his master to join him in the dungeon. En Hung recalled Luosa's incredible luck in previous dungeons. He figured he couldn't get rid of his apprentice just yet. He'd have to stick it out until they claimed the raid rewards. He agreed to Luosa's request, explaining that since Luosa's level was too low, they would first need to run the hidden two-person dungeon to level up. Luosa was overjoyed, believing he could finally relax and collect gear while hiding behind his powerful master. But Mengxing Luosa hadn't expected his master, and Hung, to have no intention of lifting a finger. And Hung simply lounged nearby, instructing Luosa to kill 99 minor monsters on his own and wait for the boss to appear before he and Hung would step in. Men are truly enigmatic. Luosa, upon hearing this, assumed it was a teaching moment. He grabbed his dagger, ready to go, but hesitated, finding the hopping little monsters rather adorable. However, in the next second, the monsters bared their fangs, their cute facade vanishing. Luosa instantly snapped into battle mode. Watching him fight, and Hung thought his equipment should be enough to handle these small fries. And Hung mused, Luosa's new leopard print gear should hold up for a while. He decided to go AFK. A short while later, Hung figured enough time had passed and logged back in. He turned to look at Luosa, expecting his silly disciple to be laden with loot. The sight that greeted him, however, was shocking. Luosa was stripped bare down to his starting gear and was running for his life, dodging the pursuing monsters. Just as the equipment-less Luosa prepared for hand-to-hand combat, his master, who had been seemingly asleep, suddenly sprang to action, swiftly dispatching all the monsters. Luosa was overjoyed, and Hung, however, was speechless. He asked Luosa why he hadn't equipped the dropped gear. Luosa, with an innocent look, explained that he wasn't trying to hoard it to sell for in-game currency, but that all the dropped items were high-level hidden gear, unusable by his level 66 character. Now, with the 99 minor monsters vanquished, the final boss, the fearsome Ni Monster King, appeared before them. It opened its massive maw, letting out an earth-shattering roar. The boss then launched a glob of green, viscous goo, seemingly aged for 1,000 years, directly at Luosa. Just as the goo was about to make contact, in the nick of time, Hung tossed a piece of green equipment to intercept the attack, shielding Luosa from harm. Then, scooping Luosa up in a princess carry, he leaped onto the Ni Monster King's head. Luosa, cradled in his master's arms, was completely awestruck by this display of prowess. Meanwhile, the Ni monster, enraged by its failed attack, roared even louder, and Hung told his bewildered disciple to hold on tight. He was about to unleash his ultimate move. Luosa obediently grabbed onto the two tufts of hair on his master's head. In the next instant, Hung dodged another glob of the 1,000-year-old goo, still holding Luosa. Then, with a focused gaze, Hang's weapon crackled with energy. Red electricity coursed through the blade. With a whoosh, the man brought his weapon down, striking the Ni monster. He landed gracefully, still holding Luosa, the bisected Ni monster, now resembling a deflated balloon behind them. Luosa stared in awe, thoroughly impressed. His master had defeated the boss in a single blow. He'd definitely chosen a reliable mentor. He then gathered the high-level equipment he'd acquired from the smaller monsters and presented it all to Hung as a token of gratitude for saving him. Observing Luosa's guileless, cheerful demeanor, Hung decided after a couple of seconds that his disciple was genuinely harmless and rather endearing. Seeing that even the minor monsters dropped such high-level gear, Hung figured the boss's loot must be even more impressive. He eagerly stepped forward to claim his prize. To his dismay, however, he pulled out a toothpick clearly meant for the boss's dental hygiene. It was utterly useless. Seeing that the boss's dropped weapon was yet another dagger, and too high-level for him to use, Luosa was once again perplexed. Hung, watching this, was puzzled. Why would this guy choose the assassin class? Using a dagger seemed so inefficient. Luosa's reasoning was even more bizarre. He'd chosen it because he thought daggers were efficient for harvesting crops. Farming is in our Chinese blood, Luosa explained. Naturally, I have to farm in a historical fantasy game too. He added that he liked the number 7, and daggers resembled 7s more than other weapons, hence his choice of the assassin class. Hung was completely dumbfounded by this logic, utterly unable to comprehend his disciple's train of thought. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He He rummaged through his inventory with a cool flourish and, after a moment, produced a gleaming scythe radiating an aura of agricultural power and presented it to Luosa. The moment Luosa laid eyes on the scythe, he was captivated. He declared it the weapon of his dreams and profusely thanked and hung once more. His tearful gratitude and starry-eyed expression left Hung speechless yet again. He told Luosa that he'd gotten the weapon by exploding a boss's backside and didn't want it because it felt tainted. Luosa, who moments before had been overflowing with emotion, instantly choked back his tears and fell silent. And Hung, quite pleased with Luosa's reaction, claimed he was teaching him a valuable life lesson: never trust anyone blindly. However, Luosa's next words stopped him in his tracks. Luosa slowly approached him, gazing earnestly into his eyes. He declared that he trusted no one but his master. With an expectant look, he asked if Hung was truly his master and wouldn't lie to him. Hung was stunned into silence for a good 2 seconds. He hadn't expected his naive disciple to be so guileless. He told Luosa to drop the hero worship filter, but Luosa insisted that someone who took him on dungeon runs, gathered materials, and asked for nothing in return had to be a good master. Seeing that reason wouldn't work, Hung abruptly turned and walked away, ending the conversation with a promise to help Luosa level up later. Luosa immediately trailed after him, asking what time he usually logged in. Unbeknownst to them both, as they chatted, the scythe at Luosa's hip activated. It was a heavenly tier artifact, the only one in the entire game, and it could only be transferred through a sincere, heartfelt gift from its owner. A week later, thanks to the heavenly tier scythe and the rewards from the hidden dungeon, Luosa's power had soared. He was cutting down opponents like weeds. He cherished the weapon in his hands, his joy overflowing. Hung remembered Luosa's desire for revenge. He offered to help him get even on the condition that Luosa whine a little. Luosa, perplexed by this strange request, wondered what kind of master he had. He was about to suggest postponing the revenge plan when Hung cut him off, telling him not to get any ideas. He declared that in his tutelage, Luosa would learn to handle his own battles. A glint entered Hung's eye, as if a mischievous plan was forming. The next moment, he assigned Luosa his task for the day: mine 500 grams of crystal ore. Then he teleported away, leaving Luosa standing alone in the wind, shouting after him that he didn't need any help with his revenge. Back in the city, Hung was leisurely sipping tea when he overheard someone talking about his naive disciple. The person was advising others not to try and leech off Luosa's good luck, claiming he brought bad luck to others. The rumor monger was the guild leader who had wronged Luosa. Not only had he cheated Luosa, but he was now slandering him, claiming Luosa was a traitor and that the gem he'd sold him for his dagger had actually belonged to him. Hung heard every word of this fabricated story. The guild leader continued to spin his lies, claiming that anyone who associated with Luosa would suffer misfortune. Hung had heard enough. He wouldn't allow anyone to slander his disciple. He set down his teacup and fixed his gaze on the still babbling guild leader. In the blink of an eye, he initiated a forced PvP duel. Before the guild leader, Northwind Slightly Salty, could react, a sharp blade of energy sliced across his throat. With a swift stroke, Hung dispatched him to the respawn point right in front of his 2 lackeys. Hung's face was stern. His naive disciple was the luckiest person in the world, and he wouldn't tolerate anyone try and tarnish that. Meanwhile, Luosa, eager to complete Hung's task, had secretly bought some ore from a merchant to make up the required amount. He was about to check his master's location to turn in the quest, when he discovered, to his surprise, that Hung was in jail. The next moment, Hung, sitting in his cell, received a barrage of messages. They were all from his naive disciple, and Hung wondered why he'd bothered to intervene in the first place. As he pondered this, the message count jumped from 18 to 48. As expected, they were all anxious inquiries from Luosa. On the other end, Luosa continued his voice message bombardment, demanding to know why Hung was in jail and whether he'd been caught doing something shady. Luosa's eyes widened in surprise at Hung's 3-word reply: "Feel better now?" Along with the message came a replay of Northwind Slightly Salty's death. Luosa burst into tears of gratitude. His seemingly heartless master had secretly avenged him. But then a thought struck him. If his master had already taken care of his enemy, who was he supposed to take revenge on now? His immediate priority, however, was getting Hung out of jail. Seeing Luosa's frantic attempts to rescue him, and Hung started to protest, but Luosa had already hung up. Jian Zhuang and Hung was utterly speechless. He didn't know where his silly apprentice had picked up such uncouth habits. She had no manners whatsoever, but at the same time, he couldn't bring himself to scold Luosa. Seeing her touching display of loyalty, landing herself in jail just to avenge him, he felt that his own imprisonment suddenly seemed almost worthwhile. The feeling wasn't half bad, actually. He even started to look forward to seeing what kind of plan his foolish apprentice would concoct to break him out. Meanwhile, Luosa stormed off, fuming, to find the man responsible, the former gang leader. She demanded he file an appeal and release her master. The man, however, simply sneered. He called Hung the gang's biggest traitor. Then he proposed a deal. If Luosa could defeat him in a forced PvP duel, he would release Hung. In truth, the former leader was just trying to trick Luosa into fighting him. That way, even if she lost, she wouldn't be imprisoned for killing him. Although she saw through his wicked scheme, after careful consideration, Luosa agreed. Seeing this, the former leader eagerly grabbed his weapon. He'd been killed by Hung numerous times already that day, and hadn't had a chance to vent his frustration. Now, finally, he could take out his anger. He brandished his great sword and charged towards Luosa, a flurry of blows raining down upon her. But in the blink of an eye, she leaped aside, effortlessly dodging his attack. The man was stunned. He'd expected her to be the same weakling as before, but she had become incredibly agile. While he was still reeling from the shock, Luosa unleashed a spinning kick to his face. The attack was so swift, it was almost invisible. The man cried out in pain, coughing violently as he looked up at Luosa, standing over him, radiating an intimidating aura. The former gang leader convinced himself that he was only so weak because Hung had killed him repeatedly, causing him to lose several levels. Refusing to accept defeat, he leaped up again, great sword in hand, boasting that dealing with a weakling like Luosa was child's play. But before he could finish his sentence, a giant rock suddenly crushed him. It turned out that a construction crane's cable had snapped. So, before Luosa could even make a move, the man was flattened by the falling stone. The former leader cried foul, accusing Luosa of cheating and demanded a rematch. But Luosa had seen through his charade from the start. He never intended to let her win. He was just trying to deceive her. Seeing his scheme exposed, the former leader didn't deny it. Instead, he cursed her, saying she deserved to be tricked. Hearing this, Luosa finally snapped. She reached for the sickle tucked into her belt, and in a flash, brandished it before the man. She declared that since he was so unwilling to accept defeat, she would teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. 3 hours later, unsurprisingly, Luosa found herself in jail. The master and apprentice sat on opposite sides of the cell. Hung couldn't believe it. The rescue she had spoken of involved her joining him behind bars. Luosa, meanwhile, felt a pang of guilt. She'd been given a life sentence. She'd effectively killed the man over 30 times, the equivalent of killing him until he couldn't log back in. And Hung hadn't realized his silly apprentice was even more ruthless than he was. But Luosa simply said he deserved it. She worried aloud about whether she would truly spend the rest of her days in prison, oblivious to the look of pride on Heng's face. He found his apprentice's fierce loyalty rather endearing. Since playing the game was impossible while incarcerated, Luosa logged out to go shopping. She met up with her best friend, Wang Shanshan, and recounted the whole story. Shanshan was not impressed. Apparently, Luosa had forgotten all about her until she couldn't play the game anymore. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. She lashed out, threatening to strangle her heartless friend. After their playful scuffle, Shanshan regained her composure and started gossiping about Luosa's master. At the mention of her master, Luosa's face lit up. She described him as incredibly handsome. She started scanning the street, searching for someone who resembled him. A couple of seconds later, she pointed to a man queuing to buy a cake, telling her friend that the man's build was similar to her master's. From behind, he certainly looked the part, fueling their imaginations. However, the man's front was a stark contrast to their expectations. He was dressed rather shabbily and wore thick reading glasses. Meanwhile, Luosa was preoccupied with another worry. She'd noticed her master hadn't been online much lately. She suspected he had abandoned her because she failed to break him out of jail. After all, she was in for life. Shan Shan, ever the supportive friend, piled on, suggesting that her master had probably found a new apprentice by now. Luosa hadn't really processed what was just said. Instead, she was picturing the guy in jail, toiling away at farm work as part of his reform. If that were the case, it would be heaven for him. After all, she'd always wanted to play a farming simulator game. Just then, a shout from a passerby caught their attention. It was the meat and egg chariot arriving. Old Man Yang, nicknamed the meat and egg chariot by everyone, was slowly making his way toward the popular meat and egg pastry shop. The old man was notorious for cutting in line. Anyone who dared to complain would find him dramatically throwing himself to the ground, feigning injury. This tactic had proven remarkably effective, so everyone had learned to seethe silently whenever he jumped the queue. Today, Old Man Yang was at it again. He bypassed the entire line, stopping right in front of the man with the handsome back. The man, who appeared to be a graduate student, was preoccupied with the sudden rescheduling of his thesis defense, leaving him no time to change clothes. He then remembered he had a change of clothes in his car and decided to deal with it later. While he was lost in thought, Old Man Yang reached out and snatched the pastry he had just paid for, acting as if it were the most natural thing in the world. This time, however, Old Man Yang's scheme was thwarted. Luosa suddenly intervened, loudly protesting his actions. On cue, the old man collapsed to the ground, wailing about being assaulted. Luosa, ever the righteous one, wasn't having it. She countered by mentioning her best friend was a doctor and could treat him on the spot. Seeing his usual tactic fail against these youngsters, Old Man Yang scrambled to his feet. He launched into a tirade, taking the moral high ground and declaring that at his age of 70, he deserved respect and deference. Thinking fast, Luosa claimed the man he cut in front of was 80, making him the true senior, and that Old Man Yang's age-based entitlement was completely unwarranted. This declaration stunned Old Man Yang into silence. A moment later, he started putting on a cloying display, trying to wheedle the man into giving up his pastry. The silver-haired man, taken aback by this bizarre turn of events, was momentarily speechless. Seeing him frozen in place, Luosa leaned in and whispered, urging him to play along and stand up for himself. Unbeknownst to her, the man's eyes widened in surprise as he recognized her face. Meanwhile, Luosa was internally lamenting that he wasn't 1/10 as sharp as her mentor. She only realized he was staring at her after finishing her internal monologue. Just as she was about to ask what he was looking at, she noticed his gaze fixed on her cleavage. Wang Shan Shan, her best friend, also picked up on the creepy vibe and immediately stepped in front of Luosa protectively. The man seemed to snap out of it, adjusting his glasses and telling them in a low voice that he would give up the pastry. Then, his demeanor shifted dramatically. Gone was the meekness, replaced by a darkly sardonic tone. He remarked that Old Man Yang must be in a hurry to reincarnate, given his apparent desperation for food, implying he might not have another meal coming. He'd reluctantly step aside and let him be on his way. Furious at the man's sarcastic barbs, Old Man Yang threw the pastry back at him and stormed off, whimpering. Luosa, witnessing this unexpected victory, was impressed by the bespectacled man's verbal takedown skills. She complimented him on his performance. Just then, he offered her the pastry, explaining he had intended to buy it for his sister, but now had something urgent to attend to. Before Luosa and her friend could refuse, he turned and left, leaving them bewildered by his strange behavior. They concluded he was a very peculiar and somewhat creepy individual. Just then, Luosa received a message on her phone. It was her mentor, inviting her to a Jianxing dungeon raid. Overjoyed that her mentor hadn't forgotten her, Luosa burst into tears of relief. Meanwhile, the man who had just left returned to his car. He removed his glasses and ran some styling gel through his silver hair. He then changed into a suit and tie, preparing for his defense. In an instant, he transformed into a strikingly handsome man. He was Hung, Luosa's mentor. Hearing the notification sound from his phone, he hoped his disguised voice hadn't given him away. He saw her reply confirming their dungeon raid that evening. The moment he saw Luosa's outfit earlier, he was reminded of her in-game avatar. He recognized him immediately. After all, the only person who would sport the exact same hairstyle in both the game and real life was his own foolish apprentice, Luosa. Time flew by, and soon it was 7:30. As agreed, the two logged in and arrived at the sentence reduction level. This challenge offered only one attempt, and so far, no one had conquered it. Although Hung was in the game, his mind wandered back to his encounter with Luosa earlier that day. He found the coincidence remarkable. Snapping back to the present, he led Luosa into the instance. The dungeon was a spider's lair, its walls draped with cobwebs, spiders crawling across the ceiling. Suddenly, Luosa, who was walking ahead, noticed something odd. He glanced back at Hung and asked why he had kept his eyes closed since they entered the dungeon. And Hung could only offer a flimsy excuse, claiming the light was too bright and hurt his eyes. The excuse was obviously childish. Luosa, suspicious, plucked a strand of his own hair and dangled it towards Hung. With lightning reflexes, the man drew his weapon and snipped the hair in midair. Luosa was stunned, and Hung had struck with precision without even opening his eyes. He became convinced that his master's reluctance to open his eyes stemmed from a fear of spiders. And Hung had been in this dungeon before. Overwhelmed by the sheer number of insects, he had developed a phobia of the spiders. Luosa, observing his master's impressive blind fighting skills, was about to conclude that he could navigate safely even with his eyes closed. Just then, Hung walked straight into a large rock, nearly splitting himself in two. After a moment's thought, Luosa reached out a hand. With the utmost tact, he claimed he was afraid of the dark and asked if his master could hold his hand. He extended his hand towards Hung once more. Touched by his apprentice's thoughtful gesture, Hung readily agreed. Just as Luosa anticipated a successful hand-holding, Hung grabbed a fistful of his hair. He declared it served the same purpose as holding hands. After this little interlude, the two continued their exploration of the dungeon. Unbeknownst to them, the spiders above were watching their every move, mocking the pair for their apparent lack of intelligence. Soon, they arrived at a puzzle. A poem held the clue to the identity of the player they needed to rescue. As they pondered the riddle, cries for help echoed from behind. Luosa turned to see a bound woman, tears streaming down her face, begging for rescue. She claimed to be the player they were searching for. With his eyes still closed, Hung remained oblivious. Luosa described the scene to him. Just as Hung was about to tell his apprentice not to rush into rescuing her, something landed on his shoulder with a soft plop. It was a spider, grinning and waving. But to Hung, this seemingly harmless creature was a monstrous beast. He reacted as if facing a mortal enemy. In one swift, fluid motion, he dispatched the spider. Luosa, impressed by his master's seamless attack, gave him a thumbs up. The woman, however, broke out in a cold sweat. She realized this man was not to be trifled with. Hung turned his fierce gaze towards her and demanded to know her true identity. Intimidated by his aura, the woman confessed. She was not the person they were looking for. The two continued their search. Faced with a multitude of bound individuals, they had to identify the correct player to rescue. Luosa was surprised by the number of decoys. No wonder no one had cleared this dungeon yet. Hung explained that to complete the level, they had to rescue the hostage and defeat the boss. Careful consideration was crucial. He recounted his previous failure, where he had mistaken an NPC assassin for the player in need of rescue, based on a misinterpretation of the poem. He urged his apprentice to proceed with caution. Before he could finish, Luosa pointed to someone, declaring he had made his choice. He indicated an old man, believing him to be different from the other captives. He encouraged Hung to think outside the box. As it turned out, the old man was indeed the correct answer. He was overjoyed that someone had finally figured it out. Luosa explained his reasoning to Hung. The poem, he argued, described the oppressed working class suffering under the tyranny of their rulers. However, periodically, these downtrodden masses would rise up and give their oppressors a sound beating. Therefore, the person most in need of help was the unbound ruler. To emphasize his point, Luosa wrote the words "help me" on the old man's forehead. He added that since the system asked who needed help the most, writing it directly on the person should suffice. As soon as the words "level cleared" left his lips, the old man was struck speechless. While the answer was correct, the reasoning behind it was utterly absurd. Hung, however, found Luosa's analysis perfectly sound and agreed with his choice. The very next second after Luo Sa confirmed the rescue, the system notified him that he had successfully located the correct player and instructed them to prepare for the boss battle. At that moment, the old man they had just rescued finally came to. He warned the two that the boss in this instance was a real-life, human-controlled NPC and advised caution. He explained that the boss was a professional esports player specially hired by the game developers. His attacks were unpredictable and his reflexes lightning fast. He was, the old man emphasized, far more challenging than a standard boss. Just as he finished speaking, a resounding thump, thump, thump echoed from the cave behind them. The three stared at the cave entrance, intensely curious about the kind of boss that would emerge. A moment later, a pair of enormous feet appeared in their view. The boss then opened its massive jaws, letting out a guttural hiss. Finally, its full form was revealed. Its colossal size dwarfed Luo Sa and Hung and the old man. The boss's intimidating aura filled the chamber. Seeing such a powerful entrance, and Hung immediately warned Luo Sa to be careful, reminding him that this was the most difficult type of boss, a human-controlled NPC. But just as he spoke, the imposing boss crumpled to its knees before them with a resounding thud. Both Luo Sa and Hung were stunned, completely bewildered by this unexpected turn of events. They had no idea what the boss was up to. Tears welled in the boss's eyes as it pleaded with them to kill it quickly. It explained that only by killing it could the old man finally leave and his own instance be unlocked. The old man was furious. He berated the boss for surrendering without a fight, claiming it was a disgrace to the game and a shameful display for a human-controlled NPC. But the boss refused to fight. It insisted that these were the first players to make the correct choice, and it was determined to let them win. The old man's anger flared. He roared that such behavior was an insult to the title of human-controlled boss. The boss retorted that if the old man hadn't been rescued, it would be trapped in this instance forever due to its programming. It confessed that it had been waiting at the entrance, hoping for a chance to face the legendary sword god. It had to get out. Watching the two argue, Luo Sa and Hung were speechless. They never imagined their simple instance run would end with the human-controlled NPC practically self-destructing before they even lifted a finger. With the instance cleared, Hung took Luo Sa to craft new equipment. Hung, resplendent in gleaming gold, looked like a golden crawfish. He had already crafted 5 high-level items in a row with 0 failures. His previous equipment had been severely damaged during his duel with the guild leader, necessitating replacements. Everyone around them was envious of his incredible luck. Looking at his own attire, Luo Sa wondered why high-level equipment had such a flamboyant aesthetic. Hung explained that the game was designed so that the higher the quality of the equipment, the more extravagant its appearance. That was why, he added, most players prefer to buy cosmetic outfits. Enlightened by Hang's explanation, Luo Sa suddenly remembered he had a cosmetic outfit too. He immediately switched to it, and Hung was astonished to realize that the rather drab outfit Luo Sa had been wearing was actually a purchased cosmetic item. With their equipment sorted, Luo Sa asked Hung about their next step, tackling the 5-person raid. Hung replied that they just needed a healer, or any other class really. He suggested Luo Sa invite a friend, if he had one interested in joining. Unfortunately, Luo Sa's friend, Junbu Fawn, was swamped with academic papers and couldn't log in. Having no other friends who played, Luo Sa suggested Hung invite some of his own. However, Hung, a self-proclaimed lone wolf who usually played solo, declined. He decided to use the in-game public recruitment system for a random match. Within seconds, 2 players applied, a DPS swordsman named Julie and her husband, Dewang, a healer. Now they had DPS and a healer, leaving just one more slot to fill. 10 minutes passed without a match. The hidden raid recruitment had caused a frenzy, with players scrambling to join, overloading the game servers, and causing a temporary crash. As Hung pondered their next move, a hand suddenly clamped down on his shoulder. A voice called out, "Zhiji." It was Xiao Long and Hang's friend. He had seen the World Chat announcement about someone crafting 5 high-level items in a row and came to investigate. Luo Sa, seeing Xiao Yilong, mistakenly assumed he was there for the raid spot and was overjoyed. Xiao Yilong, seizing the opportunity, joined the group. Luo Sa then greeted the other person and introduced himself as Hang's apprentice. Sasa was a bit awestruck, seeing the name Xiao Yilong, the Emperor of Europe, a term for someone incredibly lucky in games. He realized that the lucky player player who had been frequently appearing in the World Channel these past few days was actually him. He immediately regretted his earlier decision. He knew that Hung had tried to pass his apprenticeship on to him, and he shouldn't have refused. However, before he could finish speaking, Hung shot him a sharp look. The next second, Hung shoved a large stone into the man's mouth, silencing him and preventing any attempts to weasel his way into the raid. Xiao Yilong felt incredibly wronged. He hadn't said anything, just wanting a spot in the raid. Seeing Hung turn on him, he decided to reveal the whole story. It turned out that the day Hung had approached him about taking over the apprenticeship, his wife had caught him doing something he shouldn't have been, so he had to refuse. Since Hung wasn't giving him any face, he decided to expose him. He took the stone out of his mouth, about to tell Luosa that Hung hadn't actually wanted him as an apprentice in the first place. But before he could utter a word, Hung kicked him sky high. The man landed with a thud, creating a human-shaped crater in the floor. Xiao Yilong, indignant, asked Hung if he really intended to silence him. Hung, unwavering, his eyes full of resolve, decided to beat him into submission without further ado. Seeing the two brawling, Luosa was bewildered, but then he started to speculate. His master must be doing this to comfort him for having no friends. After all, Hung had said he was a solo player, just like Luosa. Now someone had appeared to expose his lie, which was why he was acting this way. The more Luosa thought about it, the more reliable his master seemed. He yelled for them to stop. They were only one person short anyway, so why not let him join? Xiao Yilong was instantly moved to tears, praising Luosa's kindness and beauty. He then began to flatter Luosa and berate Hung for being petty. However, before he could finish, Hung glared at him again. After all the commotion, the 5-person team was assembled, 3 DPS, 1 healer, and Xiao Yilong as a substitute. But after walking around the dungeon for a while, they didn't encounter a single monster. Just as Luosa was puzzled, a voice came from behind. It was the rabbit-headed dragon from before. The rabbit-headed dragon was surprised to see them back so soon. He then gave them their dungeon quest to eliminate the dragon traitor who was harassing good wives and mothers. He told them the traitor lived in a cave. After giving them the quest, the rabbit-headed dragon slowly disappeared. The 5-person team was dumbfounded. They hadn't found the entrance to the dungeon. Luosa suspected the rabbit-headed dragon had ulterior motives, and Hung also felt that the dragon didn't seem like a good dragon. Luosa thought it might be a trap to lull them into a false sense of security. Just as he finished speaking, his foot landed on a stone tile, triggering a clicking sound, clearly some unknown mechanism. Seeing this, everyone's hearts leaped into their throats. They all complained that he was supposed to be the Emperor of Europe, so how could he trigger a trap? The next second, a door opened beneath their feet, and they all plummeted down. Seeing everyone in free fall, about to faceplant, Luosa immediately summoned his divine beast, the Phoenix. Xiao Yilong, seeing this, felt a surge of hope, moved to tears. However, the divine beast Phoenix appeared before them in the form of a chick. Just before they hit the ground, the chick acted like a perfectly timed airbag, catching them safely. Everyone was unharmed. Looking at the unfamiliar surroundings, they were amazed. They hadn't expected a waterfall underground. As they were taking in their new environment, a voice came from nearby. A graceful figure with blue hair appeared before them. The figure's face was revealed to be that of a handsome man with delicate features and dragon horns. Luosa guessed that this man was probably the dragon traitor the rabbit-headed dragon had mentioned. He couldn't help but exclaim how handsome he was. Hung was displeased with his reaction and told him to make sure his DPS was second highest, or he'd be sent back to dig stones. Luosa looked behind him. Being second highest in DPS meant beating the swordsman who was currently lecturing her husband. After a moment of thought, Luosa declared with determination that he could do it and wouldn't disappoint Hung. However, the dragon man, observing their behavior, found them rather uncouth and grumbled about the weasels meddling again. Since he was already there, he had no choice but to teach them a lesson. The next second, the system prompted the start of the boss battle. At the same time, the dragon man raised his weapon, brimming with magical energy. However, his attempt to show off lasted less than 2 minutes and ended in failure. He was successfully ganged up on, his clothes tore to shreds. The 5-person team looked at his sorry state and sighed. So the hidden dungeon was this easy? But then Luosa noticed something was amiss. Hidden raid dungeons offered the greatest rewards. Winning this easily didn't fit the expected difficulty. Hearing this, the Dragon Man protested. They had clearly outnumbered him. Seeing such blatant bullying, he couldn't bear it any longer and prepared to unleash his ultimate attack. Xiao Yilong, seeing the Dragon Man's reaction, thought he was about to transform. He advised everyone to retreat, but the next scene left them dumbfounded. The man's ultimate attack was to yell for his wife. Suddenly, a colossal female giant burst through the cave wall and stepped squarely on the fleeing healer, a gruesome sight. She quickly scooped up the Dragon Man, who nestled in her arms and began to whine. The giantess explained her lateness. She had set traps along the dungeon's only path, but these 5 hadn't followed the script, instead free-falling straight to the entrance. Growing angrier with each word, she glared at the 5 adventurers, ready to pick someone to vent her frustration on. After a thorough and wise assessment, she decided the cross-dressing healer looked the most annoying. She immediately chose him and delivered a sound thrashing. Employing every fighting technique she knew, she pummeled him relentlessly. He cried out in agony, "Why are you all ganging up on me?" But the giantess wasn't finished. Leaping into the air, she prepared to crush him with a body slam. At the last moment, Xiao Yilong, acting as the tank, raised his shield, blocking the blow. Julie dragged the healer away. Luosa, watching everyone work together to fight the boss, was thrilled. This was his first raid. And Hung, wielding his greatsword, joined a fray with impressive, swoon-worthy moves. 20 minutes later, thanks to their teamwork, the giantess lay defeated, barely clinging to life. Everyone was exhausted except for the composed and Hung. Luosa figured killing the giantess would secure him second place in DPS. He raised his scythe, but the Dragon Man spread his arms, blocking his path. "If you want to kill my wife, you'll have to go through me." Luosa paused, moved by this dramatic display of love. The touching moment lasted only a second. Luosa attacked again. The smaller man was no match for him. In desperation, the giantess burst into tears. "Why won't you leave us alone?" she wailed. The battered healer, however, had no sympathy for her plight. He started forward, but Luosa stopped him. He asked the giantess what she meant. He'd heard she'd been causing harm. At these words, her tears stopped. "I haven't done those things," she insisted. The Dragon Man in her arms told her not to bother explaining. He believed in their innocence. Seeing the pitiful couple clinging to each other, weeping, Luosa felt a pang of sympathy. The next second, a system prompt appeared, asking if he wanted to kill the Dragon Man. Luosa hesitated. He looked at the others. "What do you think?" The healer, still furious, urged him to kill the Dragon Man and take the reward. And Hung and Xiao Yilong said they would follow his decision. With no consensus, Luosa struggled. Finally, he declared, "I'll go with my gut." He made his choice. Seeing that he had spared the Dragon Man, the healer erupted in rage, accusing him of throwing the game. Suddenly, golden light flashed, revealing the giantess's memories. They saw her as a young girl, locked in a cage, sold as a sacrifice to the dragon god to pay for her brother's dowry. But when he finally saw the legendary dragon, he found it harmless, not the monstrous being people described. It turned out that humans, blinded by greed for the dragon's treasure, were the true predators. That's why the dragon couple had been hiding here. Because Luosa hadn't killed Long Nan, he triggered a hidden quest within the instance. Everyone learned that Long Nan was pregnant. Upon hearing this, the group realized how close they'd come to killing an innocent child. Long Nan expressed her gratitude to Luosa for sparing her life and asked him to help them deal with a troublesome weasel. Confused, Luosa asked who this weasel was. It turned out to be the bald dragon that kept appearing in the instance. A system notification then appeared, announcing that the weasel instance would open in half a month. After leaving Long Nan's instance, Luosa and Hung found a place to rest and discuss the events that had just transpired. Hung expressed his relief at having such a lucky disciple, someone who seemed to stumble into good fortune. Luosa, misinterpreting the comment as praise, was overjoyed. Just as he was about to express his gratitude, the conversations of nearby players caught his attention. They were discussing his incredible luck, envious of how he triggered 2 hidden instances and a hidden mount in a single day. A woman nearby dismissed the talk of luck, asserting that hard work was more important. The conversation then shifted to the legendary swordsman, a figure of immense renown. He had emerged 2 years ago, dominating the arena rankings and eventually founding his own guild. His guild stood as one of the three dominant forces, a period of great success and influence. However, a subsequent incident led to the swordsman's disappearance and his reputation being tarnished. Some of his fans, however, believed he simply chose to remain anonymous, hidden within the game world. Luosa listened intently to these tales, his curiosity about the swordsman piqued. He didn't notice and hung, lost in his own memories. In his memories, he was being berated, called a disgrace, and unworthy of his guild. He was powerless against the torrent of insults. Luosa's voice jolted him back to reality. A sheen of sweat glistened on Heng's face, and Hung quickly changed the subject, blaming the terrible food for his discomfort. Luosa, oblivious, began discussing the swordsman, pointing to a nearby bun vendor and claiming he had the air of a legendary warrior. And Hung was speechless. The vendor was clearly just an NPC. However, Luosa's interruption had dispelled his earlier unease. He watched his disciple happily munching on a bun, finding him increasingly endearing. The next moment, Luosa's face contorted in disgust at the bun's awful taste. After a moment of thought, and Hung asked Luosa if he wanted to try the arena. Luosa was ecstatic, surprised that he might be considered arena-worthy. And Hung told him not to underestimate himself, reminding him of his prowess in the instance. He then brought up the DPS rankings from their recent run, showing Luosa in second place. Luosa was about to boast when he saw Heng's score. The vast difference between first and second place almost made him want to quit the game. He then excused himself, claiming he had to log off, and Hung readily agreed, telling him to call him the next evening when he was ready. The master and disciple exchanged goodnights, and Luosa logged off, leaving Hung alone in the bustling city. He watched the crowds, listening to the cacophony of sounds, feeling a strange emptiness in the game without Luosa's presence. The game felt strangely quiet and dull without Luosa. Seeking something to do, and Hung headed to the arena to unleash his skills on unsuspecting opponents. He cut through his opponents with ease, his scores steadily climbing as they fell before him. And Heng's points quickly climbed to 18,888. Looking at his profile, hidden at the top of the leaderboard, he sighed. The game suddenly felt utterly pointless, tedious, boring. He decided to log off immediately, pulling off his gaming sensor. He sat there, staring blankly, stroking his ginger cat curled up on the bed, lost in thought. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The call connected quickly, and he asked the person on the other end if they wanted to hang out tomorrow. The next day arrived swiftly, and Hung, sporting protective goggles, was playing a shooting game with his younger sister, and then he had mercilessly defeated her in 3 consecutive rounds. This caused Anne's face to cloud over. Her brother had invited her out, only to crush her so completely. And Hung took off his goggles, a wide grin spreading across his face. All's fair in love and war. And today, he wasn't going to hold back, even against his little sister. To soothe his sister's wounded pride, he decided to buy her ice cream as an apology. She immediately demanded two, and Hung was about to refuse when he heard the same demand coming from nearby. Luo Sa, with her younger sister Luo, was standing a short distance away. She, too, was refusing her sister's request for 2 ice creams. Apparently, the last time Luo had 2, she'd been bouncing off the walls all day, giving their teacher a near heart attack. As Luo Sa lectured her sister, and then, overhearing Luo's voice, called out her name. Luo Sa and her sister turned around, and Luo immediately recognized it. Luo Sa, meanwhile, recognized a very familiar figure, the creepy guy from outside the cake shop. At the same time, Hung realized the woman before him was his clueless apprentice from the game. The 2 little girls immediately grabbed hands and started chatting. Luo Sa introduced herself to An as Luo's older sister. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the creepy guy staring at her, which immediately irritated her. The 2 girls were making plans to play together. Luo wanted Hung to join them. Seeing her sister getting friendly with the creepy guy, Luo Sa immediately intervened. And Hung found his apprentice's dramatic reaction, so different from her in-game persona, rather amusing. He pushed up his glasses, filing the observation away for later. He then bent down and, in a cloyingly sweet voice, agreed to Luo's request to play together. Luo Sa, hearing his affected tone, only found him more perverse and punchable. Her competitive spirit kicked in, and she responded in an even more exaggeratedly childish voice. This exchange left the two little girls speechless. Soon, the two adults and two children were exploring the local amusement park together. And Luo clung to each of Hang's legs, declaring how much they loved the amusement park. Luo asked him why he was there, as he lived so far away, and it was usually inconvenient for them to play together. An explained that her brother had brought her, as he lived nearby. Watching the three of them chatting happily, excluding her, Luo felt a surge of annoyance. Just as she was about to explode, a man collapsed at her feet, pathetically asking to borrow 1,000 yuan. Seeing his pitiful state, Luo's sympathy welled up. With a grand gesture, she handed the man 3,000 yuan. Seeing how gullible she was, and Hung was certain this was indeed his clueless apprentice. He started to intervene, but in the blink of an eye, Luo had already transferred the money, and Hung was speechless. He mentally cursed her lack of speed when fighting in-game monsters. He opened his mouth to warn her that the man was a con artist, but before he could utter a word, a phone flew past his face. The next scene stunned him. Luo had the man in a hold, pinning him to the ground. Recognizing the familiar moves, Hung realized she was using the exact techniques he'd taught her in-game for fighting monsters. It turned out Luo had known the man was a crook all along. She'd seen him taking upskirt photos of women in the elevator earlier. Now, she finally had the opportunity to catch him. Luo, seeing this, moved to pick up the man's phone to look for evidence. In unison, and Hung and Luo stopped her. Doing so would be an invasion of privacy and could backfire on them. So Luo cleverly transferred 3,000. This made the scammer's actions a clear case of fraud, making it easy for her to hand the case over to the police. The two younger girls were awestruck by her quick thinking and ingenious phishing scheme. Bayer and Hung were also quite relieved. It seemed their usually naive apprentice was actually quite cautious and level-headed in real life. Thinking this, he stepped forward and patted Luo on the shoulder, continuing to speak with exaggerated emphasis. He declared that he had previously underestimated her and that she had truly opened his eyes. Just then, security personnel arrived at the scene, and Hung subsequently left with his younger sister. Watching them walk away, Luo thought the man's demeanor and way of speaking were odd. But Luo quickly explained to her sister that An's older brother hadn't always been like that. Meanwhile, An was also discussing Luo with Hung, and declared that Luo was indeed as captivating and beautiful as rumored. Hearing his sister say this, Hung subtly tried to glean more information, asking what else Luo had said. The little girl, in her sweet, childish voice, told him that Luo had recently become obsessed with wearing a helmet. Upon hearing this, Hung immediately realized the helmet was the game's censor. Luo was indeed his naive apprentice. After tidying up, Luo logged back into the game and cheerfully greeted her master. She thought her tardiness would upset him. However, the man's expression in the next moment left her stunned. Not only did he cheerfully tell her it was all right, but he also beamed, his face radiant like a blooming flower. Seeing this rare display of tenderness from her master, Luo could hardly believe her eyes. As she pondered the reason behind her master's benevolent smile, Hung urged her to join him in the arena. Luo assumed her previously strict master was finally going to be gentle with her. Little did she know that Hung was thinking that now that he knew his apprentice was his sister's close friend's older sister, he could finally transform into a full-fledged high school homeroom teacher. In the next second, he assigned Luo a mission to win their arena matches and then submit a detailed report. Luo, still oblivious, only registered the words assigned mission, thinking her master was indeed still the same. However, 2 seconds later, the full weight of the task hit her. Not only did he want her to fight 1 versus 2, but she also had to write a 100,000-word reflection. Thus, the arena echoed with her wails of despair. Yet, Hung maintained his benevolent smile. Now that he knew Luo's identity, he would no longer go easy on her. And so, after 2 days of relentless arena battles, Luo could be seen frantically maneuvering with her scythe, while Hung sat calmly behind her, observing his apprentice's performance. Based on his observations over the past 2 days, Luo's adaptability had greatly improved, and her arena rating had reached 3,880. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, Luosa was still fiercely engaged in combat on the field. She strained to block the attack of one opponent. Just as she was immobilized, the other opponent charged toward her. Just as she was about to be defeated, in the nick of time, Hung casually struck, knocking both opponents to the ground. The two opponents immediately protested, accusing Hung of cheating. But the man remained nonchalant. It was a 2 versus 2 match, after all, and a master helping his apprentice was only natural. Since Luosa's arena rank had now increased, Hung decided to play all subsequent matches with her. With his assistance, Luosa's rating quickly climbed to over 5,000. Soon, they were matched for their next battle. This time, their opponent, Dudu, recognized Hung and was surprised to see him playing doubles. Hung remained indifferent, simply stating that he was playing with his apprentice. However, upon hearing this, Dudu reacted as if he had witnessed something extraordinary, his jaw dropping in astonishment. He immediately approached Luosa, wanting to see what kind of apprentice could make Hung break his usual habits. He was about to ask Luosa what was going on, but before he could utter a word, Hang's sharp blade came slashing towards him. Dudu never expected him to attack without warning. He was about to tell Luosa to control her master, but in the next second, Luosa also flew at him, weapon in hand. This master and apprentice duo was utterly ruthless. Thus, after 3 minutes, both opponents lay defeated at their feet. Dudu, bruised and battered, muttered that Luosa's fighting style was exactly the same as her master's. Dudu's apprentice, Daodu, was deeply embarrassed. He apologized profusely, blaming himself for holding his master back. But Dudu didn't scold him. Instead, he gave him a thumbs up, assuring him that the enemy was simply too strong. Suddenly, he remembered how Anung had been so eager to pawn his apprentice off on someone else. Yet here he was, personally coaching Luosa in the arena. He must have changed his mind. An idea sparked in Dudu's mind. He slowly rose from the ground and, in the next instant, proposed to Luosa that he become his apprentice instead. He warned Luosa that staying with Anung would only turn him into a little demon. Anheng's eyes flashed with a cold glint at this blatant attempt to steal his apprentice. Daodu, meanwhile, looked bewildered and asked his master if he hadn't been satisfactory. Dudu immediately reassured Daodu, declaring that no matter how many apprentices he had, Daodu would always be the most special. Luosa, however, flatly refused Dudu's offer to become his apprentice. Undeterred, Dudu continued to sell himself, claiming that while he might not be the strongest, he excelled in other areas. Luosa simply retorted, "You've got quite the confidence while kneeling on the ground. Your mentality is impressive." That comment stung. But watching the master and apprentice banter before him, Dudu became even more convinced of his theory. Anung, that went a perennial iron tree, a metaphor for a confirmed bachelor, was finally blossoming and had fallen for Luosa. He decided right then and there that he would play matchmaker. Luosa, however, found Dudu's cheerful demeanor rather strange. The next moment, Dudu grabbed Luosa's hand, suggesting they become friends so they could stay in touch. With that, he quickly made his escape, dragging his apprentice off to queue for another arena match. He decided that since he'd just poached Anheng's apprentice right in front of him, it would be best to avoid him for a few days. But as luck would have it, his next match pitted him against the very person he was trying to avoid. There, across the arena, stood Anung and Luosa. What a coincidence! Anheng's gaze was now a mixture of amusement and murderous intent. Dudu stammered, trying to explain, but before he could get 2 words out, Anung launched a merciless attack. Seeing his master's aggressive assault, Luosa raised his own weapon, ready to join the fray. But Daodu, Dudu's apprentice, intercepted him. With a sinister smile, she suggested they play a little. Luosa, unnerved by her sudden change in demeanor, felt a sense of foreboding. Her aura was completely different from their last encounter, radiating a dangerous energy. Meanwhile, Anung and Dudu were locked in a fierce battle. Dudu insisted that Anung shouldn't be so ungrateful, as he was only trying to help him. Anung was about to retort when he heard a thud behind him. He turned to see his hapless apprentice sprawled on the ground, thoroughly trounced by Daodu. In the next instant, Daodu shifted her attack to Anung. He reacted swiftly, dodging her blow. Daodu was visibly disappointed that her ultimate attack had been so easily evaded. Unfortunately, Dudu wasn't so lucky. He took the hit head-on and landed on the ground beside Luoso with a pathetic thud. He looked at his apprentice, now battling Anung, completely baffled by his newfound prowess. Daodu turned to him, a sardonic smile twisting her lips, and asked why he was so greedy when he already had an apprentice. Seeing his seemingly innocent apprentice revealed as a hidden powerhouse, Dudu, feeling indignant, joined the fight. Luoso watched the chaotic three-way battle unfold, utterly perplexed. He couldn't understand why Daodu had feigned weakness in their previous match. He concluded that she had played the fool intentionally, all to pursue Dudu. Watching Daodu's fierce expression, he felt a pang of worry for the philandering Dudu. Meanwhile, Anung, locked in combat with Daodu, realized she was a formidable opponent, likely ranked in the top 10. Her unfamiliar face led him to believe she was using a disguise, explaining why he hadn't recognized her earlier. As the fight reached a stalemate, they both took a step back. Daodu suggested Anung switch weapons and offered him her own sword, tossing it to him with a flourish. Anung caught the sword, a thoughtful expression settling on his face. He hadn't used a sword since that incident. Meanwhile, he noticed his opponent had also switched to a new weapon, a folding fan. Seeing the woman wielding the fan, Hung immediately recognized her. It was his old acquaintance. Hung, now understanding the situation, grinned at his opponent, inviting her to come at him with all she had. In the next second, the two clashed on stage for several rounds, sparks flying between their weapons. Heng's momentum was like a rainbow. Watching his master's dashing moves on stage, Luo Sa thought he looked even more handsome than usual. Dudu also thought his swordsmanship was superior to his knife skills. After all, she had been in the top 100 of the single-player rankings, so she could tell. But this was the first time Luo Sa had seen his master use a sword. Seeing him wield it like a dragon, he felt his master was incredibly charismatic. Meanwhile, Dodo on the stage was not to be outdone. Her fan radiated bursts of light. She declared she was getting serious. In the next second, she leaped into the air, diving towards Hung. Hung reacted swiftly, gripping his sword hilt. A sizzling sound emanated from his greatsword. He used a windbreaker move, blocking the incoming attack. His brow furrowed in concentration, his hand gripping the sword with power. Seeing that he had successfully blocked her ultimate move, Dodo immediately launched a second attack. This move was swift, sharp, domineering, and utterly lethal. Dudu and Luo Sa, watching the battle, were stunned. Dudu thought her apprentice was truly terrifying. Luo Sa was about to warn his master to be careful when he saw his master, who was just on the stage a moment ago, suddenly vanish. Dodo searched for him. Just then, she sensed a surge of spiritual sword energy from behind. Sure enough, Hung had somehow circled behind her and launched an attack with his greatsword. In the next second, a booming sound echoed. Dodo, caught off guard, was struck down. Seeing Heng's fierce attack, Dudu exclaimed again, thinking how terrifying he was. Dodo now lay defeated amidst the rubble, her hair disheveled. Having lost to Hung once again after so many years, she praised him, saying his skills hadn't dulled and that he was indeed worthy of the title Sword God. Hung landed gracefully beside her. Seeing her admit defeat, Hung told her not to mention it, saying they were old friends, and with a grin, returned her fan. But Dodo inwardly fumed. He certainly hadn't treated her like an old friend when he was attacking her just now. Their duel finally over, Dudu immediately came over to scold Dodo, asking why she had pretended to be a newbie around her. But Dodo put on an innocent act, claiming she had never played in the doubles arena before and was practically a beginner. With a faux sweet smile, she walked over and grabbed Heng's shoulder, retorting that it was his fault for being fickle in the first place. Then, leaning close to his ear, she whispered, accusing him of two-timing. In the next second, her expression turned menacing as she warned him that he'd be killed if he continued to be so unfaithful. Seeing his apprentice utter such a ruthless threat in the sweetest of tones, Dudu was so shocked she became speechless and declared she wanted to sever their master-disciple relationship. After some back and forth, Dodo dragged Dudu away, bidding farewell to Hung and Luo Sa. Watching them leave, Luo Sa suddenly remembered that after the fight, Dodo seemed to have said something about his master. He stared blankly at Hung, standing before him, trying to recall what she had said. Curiosity consumed him. Two little figures battled in his mind. One argued he shouldn't pry into other people's private affairs. The other insisted he should get to the bottom of it. Watching his apprentice muttering to himself, Hung thought his brain had been scrambled in the fight. He reached out to help him up, asking if he wanted to continue. Luo Sa said he had something to do and suggested they meet again tomorrow night. With that, he bid him farewell, and Hung smiled and readily agreed. They both removed their game sensors and logged off simultaneously. However, the next day, both of them, accompanied by their younger sisters, ran into each other on the street. Luo Sa, upon seeing the creepy guy again, immediately became wary. Seeing his reaction, Hung figured his silly apprentice still hadn't recognized him. Hearing Luo Sa question why he was there, Hung thought to himself that he had to find a way to reveal his true identity. However, just as he was about to tell Luo Sa the truth, he saw the wary look on his face and found it rather amusing. So, in the next second, he changed his tack, pulling out a slightly melted ice cream cake. He smoothly claimed he was there to bring Luo a treat. And so, the two youngsters sat by a nearby fountain, happily eating ice cream. Luosa watched them eat their ice cream, drool involuntarily dripping from the corner of her mouth. Noticing this, Hung asked why she wasn't having any and mentioned how famous the ice cream cakes were at this particular shop. But Luosa, currently on her period, suffered in silence. If she dared to eat ice cream right now, it would be practically suicidal. Clutching her lower abdomen, she lied, claiming she had no appetite due to the heat. This explanation rendered Hung speechless. This was a stark contrast to his apprentice in the game, who insisted on eating ice cream whenever it was hot. He then noticed her hand on her stomach, and a realization dawned on him. He pushed up his glasses, understanding flashing across his face. This action made Luosa wary, wondering what scheme the man was concocting. The next second, Hung guided her to sit on a bench and asked her to watch his younger sister, Luo, while he stepped away for a moment. Watching him go, Luosa found him increasingly strange. She asked Luo if he was always like this, but Luo insisted that Hung wasn't strange at all, but rather handsome and gentle. Luosa was skeptical, wondering how anyone could find him handsome with his nerdy attire. Lost in thought, she suddenly heard a splash behind her. Turning around, she saw a child had fallen into the pool. The situation looked dire. Luosa immediately decided to jump in and save the child, telling her sister to stay put. Just as she was about to get up, a hand firmly pressed down on her shoulder, stopping her. Hung had returned. He firmly told her to stay where she was. He then handed her something, saying it was for her, and took off his ever-present glasses. Before Luosa could process what was happening, he vaulted over the railing and towards the pool. With a whoosh, he executed a perfect dive, entering the water to rescue the child. Luosa stared, stunned by his actions. She felt like he had been a little angry just then, and his assertive aura gave her a strange sense of familiarity. Luo reassured her, saying her brother was a very good swimmer. Meanwhile, the child's grandmother waited anxiously by the railing. Sure enough, 2 minutes later, everyone watched with relief as Hung emerged from the water with the child in his arms. Soaked to the bone, he handed the child to the grateful grandmother. The grandmother, seeing her grandson unharmed, was visibly relieved. Luosa, however, noticed something different about Hung. His wet clothes clung to him, revealing a well-defined 8-pack. His face, flushed from the exertion of the rescue, was also quite striking. Luosa was about to compliment him on his unexpected handsomeness when his now seaweed-like hair plastered to his head completely derailed her train of thought. The look was unique, unfazed, and Hung, sporting this unusual hairstyle, put his glasses back on and announced he was taking the child to the hospital, adding that Luosa needn't come along. With that, he picked up the child and left. Luosa watched him go, still trying to process everything. It suddenly struck her that he had seen perfectly well without his glasses. She then remembered the item he had given her. Opening the plastic bag, she found sanitary pads, pain relievers, and warm milk tea, all things related to her period. Luosa was stunned by his thoughtfulness. He had noticed her discomfort and taken the initiative to get these things for her. However, Luosa's mind took a strange turn. She initially attributed this to some sort of creepy observation, thinking Hung had been secretly watching her. but she quickly dismissed that thought. He was, after all, her sister's friend's brother. She then recalled Luo's insistence on his handsomeness, gentleness, and thoughtfulness. But looking back at the image of his seaweed hair, she still couldn't quite reconcile it with the word handsome. Meanwhile, after taking the child to the hospital, Hung was walking Luo home. It was now evening. He suggested that Luo move in with him, as it would be closer to her school. Unbeknownst to him, Luo had already planned on doing just that. She immediately called Mr. Lee to bring over her packed luggage. The scene then shifted to Luosa's friend, Jean Bufu, online and admiring his divine beast mount. He held the chick-like phoenix while inquiring about its master. It turned out Hung had been busy lately, constantly running dungeons. Jean Bufu figured his master must be incredibly skilled. In the few days he hadn't been online, Hung had boosted Luosa's arena rating by several thousand points. He suspected Hung might be a top-ranked player, deliberately hiding his identity to dominate lower-level matches. But Luosa dismissed the idea, boasting that even if it were true, it just proved how awesome his master was. Just then, Hung messaged Luosa, telling him to go for the last hit on the world boss. The final blow yielded substantial rewards. Simultaneously, the world boss's spawn location was announced. Numerous players converged, all vying for the final blow. One player even jokingly offered his teammates combined singlehood for the next century in exchange for landing the killing strike. The words barely left his mouth when whoosh, a green vine snaked out, ensnaring him. The boss had spawned. Its colossal form materialized before the crowd. A level 100 behemoth, it had a chance to drop Conqueror's Gold, a crucial material for crafting celestial equipment. Seeing everyone rush the boss, Jean Bufu and Luosa decided to join the fray. In a flash, both drew their weapons and plunged into the chaotic melee. Meanwhile, Hung had just helped a friend clear another dungeon. He quoted his friend a friendship price of 8,888 for his services. His friend was about to accuse him of price gouging when a system announcement flashed across the screen. Luosa had landed the final blow on the world boss and claimed the coveted Conqueror's Gold. Hung felt a surge of pride for his somewhat foolish apprentice. He was about to summon Luosa for some arena matches when he noticed something amiss. The Summon Apprentice button was grayed out, displaying an error. Hung sensed trouble. Back at the boss spawn, Jean Bufu was frantically scratching his head. A group of players had suddenly abducted Luosa. Just then, Hung appeared beside him with a whoosh, teleporting to his location. After brief introductions, Jean Bufu realized this was Luosa's master, and Hung demanded to know his apprentice's whereabouts, explaining that the system indicated Luosa's last known location was here. Jean Bufu recounted the incident. He and Luosa had encountered players trying to steal their loot. Outmatched, the other players called for reinforcements. Despite Luosa defeating them all, when Jean Bufu's guard was down, they had snatched Luosa. Jean Bufu theorized that landing the killing blow on the boss had depleted Luosa's daily luck quota. This, he believed, was why Luosa had been captured. He explained to Hung that Luosa's luck fluctuated daily, and exceeding a certain threshold invited misfortune. Hung was having none of it. He blamed Jean Bufu for not protecting his apprentice. Jean Bufu then revealed that the kidnappers belonged to the top guild, Floor Titans. Recognition flashed across Hung's face. He knew where to find his apprentice. Without another word, he turned to leave, not before warning Jean Bufu that if anything happened to Luosa, he would pay dearly. The blatant threat irked Jean Bufu. It was just a game, after all. Elsewhere, Luosa was tied up, surrounded by his captors. A man stepped forward, gripping Luosa's chin, and ordered him to hand over his loot. Luosa refused, delivering a swift kick to the man's groin. The crippling blow left the man writhing in agony. Enraged, the man tightened his grip on Luosa's throat, a sinister grin spreading across his face. He brandished a dagger, threatening to kill him if he didn't comply. He sliced off a lock of Luosa's hair as a demonstration, promising to slowly torture him in the most agonizing ways if he continued to resist. He boasted that even if Luosa's health bar reached 0, he'd have someone revive him, just to continue the torment. This was a notorious safe zone, shielded from outside interference. Luosa should give up hope, but Luosa remained defiant, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. While spitting out defiant words, he surreptitiously worked at the ropes, binding his hands. Just as he was about to stand, a figure plummeted from the sky, landing with a resounding boom. Debris flew everywhere. The force of the impact sent Luosa, moments before full of defiance, crashing into a nearby boulder. And Hung landed squarely, brushing the dirt from his clothes. He grumbled about the faulty teleportation, which had deposited him directly into the ground. He immediately began scanning the area for his disciple, hoping he hadn't arrived too late. The next moment, he turned and spotted Luosa lying near a boulder, barely clinging to life. Unaware that this was, in fact, his own doing, and Hung saw his beloved disciple's health bar reduced to a sliver. Regret flooded him. He had arrived too late, after all. The man behind Luosa, seeing Heng's menacing approach, hastily asked his identity. Before he could finish speaking, Hung raised a hand and, with a single gesture, imprisoned all the surrounding underlings. The man himself was also immobilized by a purple ring of light. Recognizing the attack, he realized it was the group imprisonment spell. He couldn't believe that someone else knew the legendary sword god's technique. While he puzzled over this, Hung, radiating a powerful aura, advanced towards him. Hung declared fiercely that anyone who touched his disciple would not escape. Just then, Luosa's weak voice called out, "Master!" Overjoyed to find his disciple alive, Heng's relief was short-lived. Luosa immediately snapped at him to stop stealing his enemies. It turned out Luosa was furious that his master had twice robbed him of the chance to claim his first kill. Hung, taken aback by his disciple's intense desire for revenge, stepped aside and allowed Luosa to handle the situation himself. Luosa's face darkened. He took a deep breath and unleashed a flurry of kicks, a whirlwind of Foshan shadowless kicks, upon the kneeling man. Watching this display, Hung couldn't help but think that his beloved disciple was even more ruthless than he was. As Luosa mercilessly continued his assault, intent on ripping out every last hair on the man's head, a woman suddenly appeared. She was the guild leader of Buddha's Palm, the hidden expert who had previously gone by the alias Dodo in the arena. Luosa, failing to recognize her, didn't stop his attack. Doku was momentarily speechless, and Hung, recognizing his old friend, intervened, suggesting they end the matter here as the man was a member of her guild. While they spoke, Luosa, eyes filled with murderous intent, had nearly scalped the man. However, weakened from his earlier injuries, he suddenly felt dizzy and began to fall backward. Hung quickly caught his disciple, holding him close with a worried expression. Luosa's vigorous hair-pulling had reopened his wounds, causing him to faint. After bandaging his disciple, Hung bid Doku farewell, leaving the rest to her. He declared he needed to take Luosa for immediate medical attention and vanished before her eyes, ignoring Doku's warning about the teleportation restrictions within the Forbidden Zone. Watching the man disappear, Doku sighed and decided to address the matter at hand. Looking at the still kneeling ninth elder, a sinister smile spread across her face. She asked him to recite the 33rd rule of the guild. He immediately responded, "No robbing or ganging up on newcomers. Dokes Smilidipend." Since he knew the rule, he had clearly broken it knowingly. She approached him, her gaze sharp as a knife, sending a chill down his spine. The next moment, she sentenced him to death. Meanwhile, Luosa stirred awake. Opening his eyes, he thought he was home, and Hung explained that, having forgotten about the teleportation restrictions, they were now airborne and would have to fly back. Luosa then realized he was resting on Heng's lap, wrapped like a human burrito. The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. A man and his disciple, alone together, one resting his head on the other's lap. This could ruin his reputation. He looked at his master, concluding that it wasn't that Hung was being inappropriate, but rather that he saw him as a brother. With this thought, he tried to sit up. However, bound like a mummy, his only option was to roll. The next moment, the unfortunate Luosa plummeted towards the ground, and Hung quickly scooped him back onto his mount. Apparently, Luosa had already rolled off 3 times while he was asleep, and Hung explained that this mount, unlike Luosa's Divine Phoenix, was a new, single-rider creature he had recently captured. Because of this, Luosa had to endure being bundled up like a dumpling on his master's lap. Luosa stared blankly quickly at Hung. He suddenly remembered the scene of his own kidnapping, the man's frantic expression. Back then, the man had looked desperate, like he wanted to destroy the world. The more he looked, the more handsome and fierce he found his master to be. He wondered which lucky girl would eventually snag him, oblivious to the fact that his love-struck expression, from Hang's perspective, resembled a pig wrapped in foil, ready for roasting. Just then, Luo Sa announced that he had rested enough and was ready to summon the phoenix. He suggested switching places with Xiao Ji, Little Chick. In the next second, the indignant Xiao Ji appeared before them and promptly kicked Hang's mount into the air. The force of the kick nearly sent Luo Sa flying as well. He immediately complained that Xiao Ji didn't care about his master at all, that if he were gone, Xiao Ji would be masterless. Watching Luo Sa's disgruntled expression, Hung recalled holding him in his arms earlier, how adorable he had looked. A strange feeling stirred within him, a flicker of something new. He clenched his fists involuntarily and quickly changed the subject, asking Luo Sa if he recognized the woman who had appeared later. He told him that the woman was the leader of the Flowing Cloud Hall Guild, the same dodo he had fought in the arena. Luo Sa was astonished to learn that the leader of the top guild was such a young, capable, and beautiful woman. But then he worried that if they were in the same guild, she might let the matter drop. And Hung assured him that Doku was a woman of strong principles and wouldn't tolerate such behavior from her guild members. Reassured by his master's words, Luo Sa relaxed. Then his attention was captured by the breathtaking scenery before him, and he couldn't help but gasp in admiration. He pointed ahead, urging Hung to look. Before them hung the enormous, luminous moon of the Forbidden Zone, bathed in its silvery light. Luo Sa's face seemed even more captivating. Watching her smile bloom beneath the moonlight, Hung was momentarily lost in the moment. He quickly regained his composure, unaware that beneath the moon, the hearts of master and disciple were quietly changing, a subtle affection blossoming between them. The next day, a server-wide announcement caught everyone's attention. It was issued by Doku, the leader of the top guild. She informed everyone that the vice leader who had stolen materials during the boss fight, along with his subordinates, had been dealt with. She also issued a formal apology to Luo Sa and encouraged everyone to seek justice for any wrongs committed against them, stating that she would not tolerate such behavior. Luo Sa pondered the announcement, recalling how the sword god had also become infamous server-wide for stealing materials. He remembered that the sword god had used underhanded tactics to steal materials, setting up everyone present, which led to a server-wide attack and his downfall overnight. Thinking about the notorious sword god, Luo Sa's curiosity was piqued. He searched the forums for information about him, but found mostly useless chatter. Then, a particular record caught his eye. It stated that the sword god had been the arena's PK champion and had even defeated the leader of Flowing Cloud Hall. Remembering that this leader was Doku, the woman his master had defeated, Luo Sa decided to investigate further. The next second, he was transported to the arena where the battle had taken place. Standing in the arena, Luo Sa looked around. Suddenly, a figure came running towards him at high speed. It was a masked man wielding a long sword. Before Luo Sa could react, the masked man was upon him. Luo Sa started to move, but the man passed right through him, charging towards the opposite side. Luo Sa realized it was a replay, a phantom he couldn't touch. Watching the man's retreating figure, he thought the man's build looked familiar. The man raised his greatsword, preparing to attack his opponent. Seeing the familiar motion, Luo Sa froze. The next second, the man unleashed his ultimate attack, aiming to knock the fan from Doku's hand. There was a clang, and Doku mocked the man, saying the sword god's move seemed underdeveloped. Just as the two were about to clash, Luo Sa pressed the pause button, stepping between the figures to analyze the scene. He remembered what Doku had said last time. After all these years, he'd lost his master again. That meant there couldn't be many people who could beat him. Yet, the way the sword god had just attacked was exactly the same as his master's move. The thought struck Luo Sa like a bolt of lightning, transforming him into a Sherlock Holmes of the virtual world. The more he pondered, the more convinced he became. Judging by the sword god's aura and physique, it had to be his master. The mask the sword god wore now was probably just a cheap cosmetic substitute for the real gold version. He was about to reach out and rip off the mask, eager to see the man's true face, when he suddenly remembered this was a phantom. He couldn't actually touch it. Just as Luo Sa was at a loss, he noticed a small detail. he saw a mole on the inside of the sword god's lip. This immediately brought to mind his master, Manhwa. He remembered lying on his master's lap last night, and from that angle, he'd glimpsed a similar mole on Manhwa's lip. The seed of suspicion had been planted. Luo Sa's curiosity grew, and he felt he had to confirm his suspicions with his master. He immediately sought out Manhwa and asked him to turn around. And Manhwa, bewildered, turned around with a questioning look, unsure what his silly apprentice was up to. Unexpectedly, Luo Sa reached out and pressed her fingers against his lips. The sudden physical contact left Manhwa frozen in place. He stared at her, dumbfounded, about to ask what was going on, when the situation took a bizarre turn. Luo Sa abruptly pulled up his lip. Sure enough, there it was, hidden on the inside of his lip, the telltale dark mole. The truth revealed, Luo Sa stood stunned, unable to process the revelation. She hadn't expected even the placement of her master's mole to be identical to the sword god's. It dawned on her. Her incredible luck had led her to stumble blindly into becoming the apprentice of the top-ranked player in the entire server. A casual act of respect had landed her a master who was a legend. But then another thought struck Luo Sa. If he was the sword god, then he was also the infamous villain everyone talked about. She immediately spiraled into conspiracy theories. Why would such a notorious villain take a newbie like Meng Xing as an apprentice? It couldn't be for any good reason. Luo Sa grew increasingly anxious, worried that he was after her account, but he had helped her build it up from scratch. Then she worried he might be after her, personally, but she was just an ordinary girl with a less than stellar personality. Surely, he wouldn't be interested. Deep down, Luo Sa knew seeing was believing. After all this time, she already considered Manhwa a genuinely good person. Every time she opened a treasure chest and got something good, he would stand beside her, not envious, but genuinely happy for her. With this in mind, she decided to question her master further. She asked him when he started playing the game. Manhwa replied that he'd been playing since the server launched and asked why she was suddenly so curious. Luo Sa pressed on. If he'd been playing for so long, he must have a lot of friends. At this, Manhwa looked away, his expression turning cold, and remained silent. After a long pause, he finally admitted that he had had many friends, but they had all gone their separate ways. Seeing her master's pained expression, Luo Sa didn't know how to comfort him. Through the rose-tinted glasses of her apprentice adoration, she concluded that Manhwa must be an introverted, loving soul who simply didn't know how to interact with others. And such a powerful player must have taken her on as an apprentice because he appreciated her boisterous, outgoing personality. With this thought, she grabbed Manhwa's hand, determined to cheer him up. She led him to a bridge overlooking the bustling, vibrant game world. Manhwa was puzzled, unsure why they were there. Suddenly, Luo Sa pulled out an adorably shaped dog-themed camera. In her mind, taking some nice pictures of Manhwa would boost his confidence and help him open up. Since he was a brooding, introverted type, she decided to demonstrate first. She asked him to take her picture, calling it a lesson in confident radiance. However, to Manhwa, Luo Sa's poses were indistinguishable from those of a grandmother taking a picture. After a flurry of awkward posing, Luo Sa, now sweating profusely, took the photos Manhwa had snapped. Her jaw dropped. His photography skills were clearly lacking. She was crooked and cross-eyed in every shot. He immediately consoled himself, thinking that his photos always looked like this and that his master must be a skilled photographer. Manhwa, however, told him to cut the flattery. He knew his own photography skills were nothing special. Left with no other options, Luo Sa took the camera and started taking selfies. But in that instant, he saw the dejection on Manhwa's face at not being able to help. An idea sparked in his mind. In the next second, he pulled Manhwa to his side, suggesting they take a selfie together. He wanted to capture the moment forever, preserving the memory in a photograph. However, after several clicks of the shutter, the photos weren't the beautiful and handsome images Luo Sa had envisioned. They were either oddly angled or hopelessly blurry. Some even made their faces look ridiculously wide. Watching Manhwa's dismayed expression as he looked at the photos, Luo Sa suddenly remembered he wasn't a selfie expert. He was a Photoshop expert. His selfies relied entirely on post-production editing. The raw photos revealed the truth. He could only laugh awkwardly trying to smooth things over, telling Hung that maybe this was just how they really looked. Then, taking the pile of unflattering photos from Heng's hand, he left disappointed. It seemed his grand plan to cheer up his master had ended in failure. Hearing the words, "cheer up his master," Heng's eyes widened in realization. Luosa had orchestrated this whole thing just to try and make him happy. With this thought, he pulled out the photo he had hidden earlier. Looking at the photo, he thought to himself that the operation couldn't be called a complete failure. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was the best of all the selfies, the two of them looking surprisingly harmonious together. The scene shifted. Offline from the game, Hung sat in his room, sipping tea. He listened to his younger sister, and then talking on the phone. She seemed to be making plans with Luo Luo to go out, meeting at Happy Coast tomorrow. The name Luo Luo caught his attention. The thought of possibly seeing his silly apprentice again piqued his interest. He turned to Anin, saying he would go with them tomorrow. Anin started to protest, but he didn't give her a chance to speak, shutting his door and leaving her standing there, speechless. The next day arrived quickly, and Hung was stunned when he saw the large, muscular man who greeted him. He had expected to see his apprentice, but instead, Luo Luo was with this imposing figure. Luo Luo seemed equally confused by Heng's reaction. Anin, sipping her milk tea, simply said they should ignore him. It was his own fault for not letting her finish speaking last night. Meanwhile, Luosa, having not accompanied his sister, was battling alone in the arena. For days, he had been ranking up under Heng's protection. Today, he decided to take the reins while his master was away. 2 hours later, however, a thoroughly defeated Luosa slumped dejectedly at the arena entrance. He grumbled internally. All his teammates had been terrible, completely uncooperative. One even kicked him away just as he was about to unleash his ultimate ability. Another teammate, a healer, insisted on running to the front lines to fight. Like a donkey, he couldn't pull back. His arena score had gone up, but these matches had been infuriating. Just then, a team invitation popped up unexpectedly. Luosa looked up. A handsome pink-haired man stood before him, a top 100 ranked player. Luosa was shocked by his high ranking and asked if he had added the wrong person. The handsome man grinned, assuring him he hadn't made a mistake. He was looking for Luosa specifically. Luosa was puzzled and worried that teaming up with him would cause the man to lose points. But the man remained unconcerned. With the man's insistence, Luosa agreed to join him in the arena. He figured the man was probably just a high-level player willing to carry a newbie. He secretly rejoiced, thinking that with this high-ranking player's help, he would surely gain points easily. However, this expert seemed to be a fraud, dying even faster than Luosa in several matches. Feeling utterly betrayed, he questioned the man, asking if these frequent mistakes weren't a bit excessive. He now strongly suspected the man's high rank was bought, his actual skill being abysmal. The comparison made him miss the days when his master was around. They had always cooperated well, their teamwork seamless and intuitive. Luosa dominated the arena. He felt his Shifu, master, was eternally powerful and a reassuring presence. The more Luosa thought about it, the less he could contain himself, bursting into tears, completely disregarding the presence of a stranger. He cried out, "I miss Shifu." He checked his arena score. Thankfully, his teammates' superior equipment had kept them from lagging behind. Thinking of this, Luosa stopped crying. Seeing this reaction, the man, realizing Luosa hadn't blamed him for his poor performance, found him rather amusing. In truth, he had been asked by someone to intentionally get close to Luosa. His friend, having heard he was playing the same full dive VR game, had asked him to look after Luosa. And so, having regained his composure, Luosa continued playing duo Q with the man beside him. However, their next match paired them against Dudu and his apprentice Xiaoya. Seeing Luosa duo queuing with another man, Dudu immediately demanded 500 Jin as hush money, threatening to report him to Hung otherwise. Luosa wasn't about to back down. He countered, pointing out the unfamiliar face of Dudu's new apprentice and asking if Hung knew about him. At this, Dudu immediately caved. Luosa seized the opportunity and demanded hush money in return. Though annoyed, the man had no choice but to comply. Receiving the money, Luosa beamed. Watching him, Dudu thought he was acting more and more like Hung. Seeing their exchange come to a close, the pink-haired man suggested they start the match. After a brief preparation, the two teams, Luosa and the pink-haired man versus Dudu and Xiaoya, were ready. The 2v2 arena battle was about to begin. Meanwhile, Hung and his companion's beach trip had ended. Luo noticed his unusual quietness, and then whispered to him that her brother was thinking about Sasa. Upon hearing this, all three turned to look at Hung, making him feel uncomfortable. Just as he was about to ask why, Dudu messaged him, tattling that Luosa had run off with another man and swindled him out of 500 Gene. He attached a picture of the two of them in the arena. Looking at the photo, Hung felt a flicker of recognition. The pink-haired man beside his apprentice seemed familiar. However, seeing Luosa duo queuing with someone else still irritated him. He tapped his phone, growing angrier with each passing moment. Meanwhile, Dudu, now offline, was practically ecstatic, eager to see Heng's reaction. However, Heng's reply was simply, "Can't even beat my apprentice. Delete your account." By this point, Luosa, thoroughly defeated, was huddled in a corner of the arena. The pink-haired man feigned concern. Seeing how badly the man had played, Luosa finally understood how his Shifu must have felt carrying him in arena matches. Just as despair washed over him, a sudden bright light blinded him. Through the dazzling light, Luosa saw his savior, his male bodhisattva, finally appear. Overwhelmed with emotion, he immediately collapsed at the man's feet, sobbing and expressing how much he had missed him. Seeing his silly apprentice like this, Hung knew the duo Q hadn't gone well. He felt a surge of satisfaction. Due to the sudden teleport, the pink-haired man ended up pinned beneath him. The man loudly accused him of doing it on purpose. Seeing his teammate recognize his Shifu, Luosa realized they knew each other. The pink-haired man started to explain that he and Hung had duo queued before and was about to continue boasting when Luosa interrupted, asking if he'd been beaten by his Shifu multiple times. This pleased Hung immensely. Deciding to ignore the pink-haired man, he turned to Luosa and asked if he had done his daily quests. With that, he whisked Luosa away, leaving the pink-haired man standing there dumbfounded. Watching Hung so eagerly pull Luosa away, the man felt a sense of unease. He frowned, recalling his friend's request. His friend had instructed him to deal with anyone who tried to take advantage of Luosa, but he was clearly no match for Hung. It seemed he would have to try a different approach. He called Xiao Long, inquiring about the time Hung had tried to give Luosa away. He also asked if he could still join Luosa's hidden raid. Xiao Long told him there were no spots left. The other two spots had been randomly assigned to a couple. Hearing it was a couple, the pink-haired man filed that information away, a new plan forming in his mind. So, after his meddling, the healer and the tank's relationship within the raid group was successfully sabotaged. 2 spots in the raid opened up immediately. Hung, however, still looked at the pink-haired man with disdain, pushing him away, quite resistant to his joining. Now, the 5-person team only needed a healer. Luosa suggested finding another one. At this moment, Jean Buffon messaged him, timely filling the team's vacancy. After Luosa pulled him into the group, the hidden 5-person raid team was officially assembled. Soon, the group arrived at the dungeon. The weasel, disguised as a dragon, saw that Luosa had brought people to challenge him so quickly. He was indignant and pretended to cry. However, in the next second, Luosa exposed him. It turned out that this weasel had been impersonating a dragon for years, lurking in various villages and harming people. He made the villagers believe that Long Nan was responsible. He also, through a series of coincidences, set up the virgin trap. The weasel, fearing that he would be discovered and unable to defeat a real dragon, usurped the villagers and killed Long Nan. Even after Long Nan escaped into the cave, he continued to impersonate a dragon, asking players to help kill him. Now that the truth had finally been revealed, he could only drop his disguise. The next second, with a boom, a massive body suddenly appeared before them. The weasel, revealing its true form, lunged at the group. Seeing this, Hung immediately directed Jean Buffon to heal from the back. He also took out his weapon, preparing for battle. However, at this moment, he suddenly felt his legs weaken. Then, with a thud, he collapsed to his knees. Luosa rushed forward to help him up, wondering if it was the weasel's noxious fumes that caused this. So, Jean Buffon immediately used his skill, casting a healing spell on Hung. But after his flurry of flashy actions, Hung remained unresponsive. Jean Buffon began to suspect his new skill was a $9.99 counterfeit he bought from Pinduoduo. Behind him, the pink-haired man revealed a sinister smile. It turned out that he had painstakingly joined the raid to drive a wedge between Luosa and Heng's master-disciple relationship. He had already smeared in Heng's scabbard with a weakening poison, something ordinary healing spells couldn't dispel. He believed that as long as Luosa saw in Heng's weak and powerless state, he would be utterly disappointed. Then, he could seize the opportunity and surely make Luosa look at him with new eyes. However, plans never go as expected. In the next second, he and the others were knocked unconscious by the weasel's fumes. Now, only Luosa, with his purifying skincare, remained standing. He looked at Hung, unconscious in his arms, and felt extremely anxious. He felt that his master's condition seemed the most serious and the weakest. So, he immediately stood up, holding his sickle and threatening the weasel to help everyone recover. But due to the vast difference in strength between him and the boss, the sickle was cut in half in the next second. However, at this moment, Luosa's incredible luck struck again. The broken sickle unexpectedly unlocked its ultimate form. It even had a chance to instantly kill the boss. This sudden turn of events surprised everyone. But the weasel, looking at the small weapon in front of him, didn't take it seriously. He even poked it proactively. Unsurprisingly, in the next second, he lay dead before everyone. The other teammates also picked up the equipment dropped by the boss, a book of constipation for each of them. Meanwhile, the pink-haired man, seeing his plan for the day had failed, was about to sneak away when Hung stopped him. It turned out he had known all along about the man poisoning him, only pretending to be weak in front of Luosa. The pink-haired man was stunned. He never expected that the person he was trying to deal with was actually a schemer himself. After warning the pink-haired man, Hung felt that his motives were impure and that Luosa should be more cautious. However, he noticed that his disciple was standing motionless with his back to him. He was puzzled. Luosa turned around, teary-eyed, thanking him for leaving such a powerful weapon to him. To repay his master, he decided to make Hung a new weapon. The two quickly arrived at the forge. Faced with a forging success rate of only 0.0001%, Luosa didn't hesitate. He believed in his lucky nature. Sure enough, in the next second, a gleaming, radiant heavenly weapon appeared before them. Hung watched Luosa's joyful expression after successfully forging the weapon and felt a pang of disappointment in his heart. He thought Luosa was eager to forge a weapon simply to replace the scythe he had gifted him. However, in the next moment, Luosa cheerfully revealed that this new weapon was actually a gift for him. The man was stunned, rooted to the spot. He hadn't expected his apprentice to craft a weapon specifically for him. He grumbled that Luosa hadn't told him sooner, as the weapon recipe he'd provided was intended for a woman. The next second, the heaven-grade weapon transformed into its final form. The blade resembled a bouquet of vibrant, blooming flowers. Seeing his master's speechless reaction to the weapon, Luosa was about to decide to keep it for himself. But before he could finish his sentence, the man snatched it away. This sudden movement led to an accidental hand-holding, leaving them both momentarily frozen. Luosa was the first to break the silence. He called it a beautiful blunder and promised to forge another weapon for his master later. But Hung insisted on keeping the gift. He fiercely declared that anyone who dared to criticize his flower-like blade would be silenced permanently. Luosa, standing behind him, immediately clamped his mouth shut, a flicker of unspoken words in his eyes. Hung continued to admire the flower-like blade, his satisfaction growing with each glance. Seeing the look of contentment on his master's face, Luosa felt relieved that he hadn't completely messed up. However, the flamboyant weapon soon attracted the mockery of a passerby. The next second, the passerby paid the price for his laughter, instantly dispatched to the respawn point by Hung. Assaulting someone in a safe zone drew the attention of a constable NPC. Unfazed, and perhaps even amused, the NPC also scoffed at the appearance of the weapon. Hung was about to teach the NPC a lesson, but Luosa stopped him. NPCs, after all, were not to be trifled with. As the two argued with the NPC, the pink-haired man watched from behind a wall, taking in the scene. Observing the master and apprentice's united front, he pondered, realizing he would need a different approach to fulfill the task his friend had given him. Meanwhile, Hung couldn't resist retaliating against the NPC. After a brief altercation, he found himself penalized, sentenced to the eternal slumber tower, he reassured Luosa, claiming he'd been there before and could clear it in just 2 days. He then instructed his apprentice to chop down 3,000 trees while he served his time. Obediently, Luosa agreed, suspecting his master's punishment stemmed from lingering resentment. As he listlessly chopped wood, the pink-haired man appeared above him, offering a greeting. Seeing Hung absent, the pink-haired man renewed his attempts to sway Luosa to his side, urging him to become his apprentice. He jumped down from the tree as he spoke. Claiming to have a secret to share, he revealed Heng's past attempts to get rid of him, presenting chat logs as proof. To further convince Luosa, he called Xiao Yilong for confirmation. He urged Luosa to recall Heng's indifferent treatment, leaving him with tasks while he went off to enjoy himself. Luosa replayed his memories with his master, still somewhat skeptical of the pink-haired man's claims. Seeing Luosa's lingering loyalty, the pink-haired man produced another, more recent chat log. The timestamp clearly indicated the previous night, showing Hung agreeing to hand over his apprentice. This new evidence finally struck a chord. Luosa's expression darkened, and he fell silent. Anger building, he swung his axe at the pink-haired man, demanding to know why he was only revealing this now. He didn't believe the man had gone to such lengths simply to drive a wedge between him and Hung. The pink-haired man explained that he was acting on someone else's request to look after Luosa, refusing to divulge the person's identity. Unable to extract the answer he sought, Luosa didn't press further. Troubled by the revelation of his master's betrayal, he decided he needed time to think. With that, he logged off right in front of the pink-haired man. Witnessing Luosa's abrupt departure, the man couldn't help but think that this apprentice was proving to be quite a challenge. He then reopened the chat log from the previous night with Hung. As suspected, the portion Luosa had seen was taken out of context, and Hung hadn't actually wanted to get rid of him. But the memory of Luosa's decisive reaction gave the pink-haired man pause. The scene shifted. Luosa, who hadn't logged in for days, was busy in his office preparing for a competition the following day. Meanwhile, Hung had been persistently trying to contact him in-game, only to be met with a string of excuses. Luosa desperately wanted to confront his master about the supposed rejection. He was both terrified of confirmation and resentful that Hung hadn't been upfront from the start if he truly didn't want him as an apprentice. His frustration mounted. Being scammed by the unscrupulous guild leader hadn't even caused this level of turmoil. Just as he was about to lose his mind, Hung sent another message, inviting him to a dungeon run that evening. After a fierce internal debate, Luosa bravely declined, and Hung, completely oblivious, was puzzled by Luosa's repeated rejections. While in the solo arena, he suddenly spotted the pink-haired man approaching with a malicious glint in his eyes. The man asked point-blank if he had given up on Luosa. A bewildered Hung had no idea what he was talking about. The man burst into laughter, tears welling in his eyes. He revealed that he had told Luosa everything about Heng's supposed attempt to ditch his apprentice. He added that Luosa hadn't logged in for 5 days, clearly having believed his story. He then mocked their supposed bond as nothing but a facade. The man's words, coupled with Luosa's recent behavior, made everything click into place for Hung. He lashed out, delivering a powerful blow to the man's stomach. He left the man crumpled on the ground, barely recognizable, and then placed a hefty bounty on his head. Having pieced together the truth, Hung immediately logged off and sought out his sister, and then he hoped to learn Luosa's school and major. Luosa hadn't answered any of his calls, and Hung regretted not revealing his identity sooner, both in-game and in real life. Now, he didn't even know where to find Luosa to apologize in person. Overwhelmed by frustration, he collapsed by his sister's bed, sighing dramatically. Just as despair threatened to consume him, his junior called, inviting him to participate in the university's Yuan tournament the next day. The next day arrived quickly. Upon arriving at Beta University, Hung was intercepted by his enthusiastic juniors. As he was about to impatiently brush them off, a familiar figure caught his eye in the bustling crowd. The person he had been searching for was right there, and Hung assumed Luosa was also participating in the tournament. His juniors, noticing his intense gaze, eagerly offered to get Luosa's WeChat contact information for him. After their flamboyant display, Luosa revealed his identity. His ID badge clearly stated he was a Beta University fine arts teacher and the organizer of the tournament. Mortified at having tried to get a teacher's WeChat, the 3 students immediately immediately threw Guachichi under the bus, claiming he had put them up to it. And Hung was stunned. He never imagined meeting the person he'd been searching for under such awkward circumstances. The five of them proceeded to walk across the campus, enveloped in a palpable, awkward silence. As they walked, and Hung lamented internally. He had longed to see his apprentice, but certainly not like this. His silly in-game apprentice was a teacher, 6 years his senior. The thought of his carefully cultivated image as a mature and dependable master crumbling before his eyes was almost too much to bear. He dramatically collapsed onto the roadside, overwhelmed. Luosa, oblivious to Nhang's theatrics, was preoccupied with his master's messages. He was increasingly convinced that Nhang's words had indeed implied a reluctance to take him on as an apprentice, explaining his constant attempts to push him away. And he, Luosa, had repeatedly misinterpreted those actions as kindness. The more Luosa thought about it, the more embarrassed he became. The next moment, he lost control and started banging his head against a nearby utility pole. He had inadvertently fallen into this awkward and infuriating situation again. He was so embarrassed that he hadn't dared to answer his master's voice calls. Lost in thought, he no longer felt like showing the others around. He was about to tell them to go to the competition venue themselves, when Nhang, who had been looking down, suddenly lifted his head. With an earnest and flattering tone, he begged Luosa to continue the campus tour. Looking at the man's innocent and sincere expression, Luosa reluctantly agreed. He then led the group of boys to the university cafeteria. He treated them to the campus's exclusive milk tea. The 4 boys accepted the drinks and thanked Luosa one by one. As they were enjoying their drinks, Nhang, for some unknown reason, suddenly ran to a nearby trash can and started vomiting violently. It turned out that the milk tea Luosa had given him was passion fruit flavored, the flavor he hated most. Seeing that the man shared the same peculiar taste as his master, Luosa fell into deep thought. He was increasingly struck by the similarity between Nhang's physique and his master's. But the thought of his master brought back the memory of how he had initially hidden his identity and his reluctance to take Luosa as a disciple. Luosa immediately started to fume. Seeing the terrifying expression on Luosa's face, the other 3 students trembled in fear, thinking that he disliked their senior Nhang. Sure enough, the next second, Luosa, unable to contain himself any longer, kicked Nhang, sending him flying. As he kicked, he roared, "You damn master! Why are you playing with me?" However, as soon as the words left his mouth, he realized he had kicked the wrong person. Nhang was not his master. Nhang didn't blame him, however. He simply asked why Luosa seemed to have such a problem with him today. Luosa explained that he kept mistaking him for a friend. Unable to resist Nhang's persistent questioning, Luosa decided to tell him everything. After they arrived at the school restaurant, he told Nhang about his apprenticeship in the virtual game. Luosa felt like his master's actions had made him look like a fool. Something that could have been explained in a single sentence had been kept from him until now. He felt that if his master hadn't wanted to take him on as a disciple, he could have just said so from the beginning. Then Luosa wouldn't have had to find out from someone else's screenshot. Listening to Luosa's heartfelt questioning, Nhang felt he was in the wrong. He hadn't considered things from that perspective. He cleared his throat and started to defend himself, explaining that the screenshot didn't tell the whole story. But Luosa had already realized that the screenshot was taken out of context. He believed that his master was genuinely good to him, but that didn't change the fact that his master had played him. He was angry, but also embarrassed by his previous clingy behavior towards his master. The more he thought about it, the more he felt he had been reading too much into things. He didn't know how to face his master now. As soon as he finished speaking, Nhang, sitting opposite him, grabbed his wrist. The man declared resolutely that from now on, he would be the one to actively pursue him. However, before he could finish his confession, his fellow students dragged him away because the competition was about to start, leaving Luosa staring blankly at the sudden turn of events. He didn't understand what Nhang had been trying to say. The next moment, amidst the cheers of the crowd, the annual gaming league officially began. The host announced that the player with the highest score within half an hour would be crowned the champion. Meanwhile, Luosa stood beside a plush bear, still pondering Nhang's words. It finally dawned on him. Nhang, the man he had considered a creep, was actually his master in the game. The realization that he had been kept in the dark for so long sent a wave of fury through him. So that was why Nhang had been staring at him, he had recognized him back then, but he had chosen to keep his secret. Luosa grew angrier with each passing thought, his fury simmering like a volcano about to erupt. Standing on the stage, Hung seemed to sense Luosa's anger. Just then, the host invited him onto the platform, announcing that if he won, he would have the opportunity to give an acceptance speech. Hearing this, Heng's mind raced, and he immediately came up with a new idea. When the host announced Hung should proceed to V2 station for the challenge, Luo Sa was completely stunned. The real life Hung felt vastly different from the idealized master in Luo Sa's mind. Moreover, he hadn't expected Hung to be so much younger than himself, and a university student at that. His curiosity about the unfinished sentence Hung had uttered before going on stage grew. Meanwhile, Hung, determined to win the championship, had already achieved 30 consecutive kills. He firmly held the top spot on the leaderboard, securing the championship. Basking in the deafening applause of the audience, he slowly walked towards the podium, picking up the microphone to deliver his acceptance speech. He expressed his joy at participating in the gaming league as a Keifu player. The next second, in front of thousands of spectators, he launched into a heartfelt apology. Hung confessed that he had indeed intended to cruelly abandon Luo Sa. But now, he found himself gradually captivated by Luo Sa's radiant personality and had grown fond of him. Unaware of this passionate confession, Luo Sa stood beside him, mortified, his toes curling in embarrassment. As Heng's fervor intensified, on the verge of blurting out Luo Sa's name. At that critical moment, Luo Sa, clad in a teddy bear costume, delivered a swift blow, effectively silencing him. The next second, he dragged the unconscious Hung away from the scene. Luo Sa brought Hung to the infirmary. Fortunately, he only suffered a mild concussion and no other injuries. The doctor, assuming Luo Sa was Heng's boyfriend, gave a few instructions before leaving. Hung, sitting on the hospital bed, watched the replay of the competition and chuckled involuntarily. Seeing Heng's amused demeanor, Luo Sa's anger flared. He never imagined he'd become meme material. His resentment grew, convinced Hung had deceived him, keeping him completely in the dark. Hung, noticing this, reached for Luo Sa's hand to explain, but Luo Sa, still fuming, quickly pulled away, refusing to acknowledge the deceiver before him. Hung immediately feigned a headache, whimpering softly. Seeing Luo Sa's immediate concern, he grasped his wrist again, offering a sincere explanation. He hadn't meant to do it, he explained. Luo Sa hadn't been responding to his messages or calls, which led him to orchestrate the whole charade. Hung knew Luo Sa was usually quick to react, but his continued absence after the deception forced his hand. After listening to his elaborate explanation, Luo Sa slapped him. He demanded to know how long Hung intended to keep up the pretense if Pinky hadn't told him the truth. Hung sighed deeply. He admitted his initial deception stemmed from not being ready for someone to enter his life. He continued the charade out of fear that Luo Sa would be disappointed and reject him as his master. Furthermore, it hadn't initially occurred to him to be upfront. However, as he spent more time with Luo Sa, he realized he cherished their time together. Touched by his sincerity, Luo Sa decided to tentatively forgive him, telling him to stop following him around. Hung immediately feigned another headache, looking at Luo Sa innocently, hoping he wouldn't be angry anymore. He found Luo Sa's contrasting attitudes towards his in-game and real-life personas amusing, which fueled his deception. Seeing Heng's earnest expression, Luo Sa finally forgave him completely, figuring they were even after the slap. With the misunderstanding resolved, Hung invited Luo Sa to join him online the following night, promising to take him somewhere special. Soon, they arrived at the in-game marriage location. The matchmaker greeted them with a smile, remarking on another new couple. Luo Sa finally realized Heng's intention was to become his in-game partner, Hung proceeded to boast about his in-game wealth and fame, presenting himself as a rare and powerful player. However, Luo Sa remained unimpressed. He couldn't fathom going from anger to suddenly becoming in-game partners. He wasn't ready to accept. Hung believed he had already made a genuine and heartfelt confession in the previous round. He sincerely hoped that Luo Sa would accept him, gazing at him expectantly with wistful eyes. But Luo Sa remained hesitant. In his mind, Hung in reality and his master in the game were two completely different identities. He couldn't reconcile the two. His thoughts were a tangled mess. Seeing their prolonged indecision, the matchmaking NPC, Carl, initiated a trial of true heart instance for the pair. In the next second, Hung and several others found themselves locked in a yellow room. Outside the room were other players, just like Luo Sa, hesitant to accept their partner's proposals. Inside the room, a strange, affectionate monster roamed. It would grab anyone who failed to dodge its advances and lavish them with unwanted affection, forcing them to experience the feeling of being loved by something they disliked. Only when the players outside chose to rescue them could they escape unharmed. The purpose of this trial was to reveal their true feelings. If their love was genuine, they would choose to rescue their partner. As soon as the matchmaker finished speaking, the monster inside the room began to target everyone. Hung dodged repeatedly, narrowly avoiding its touch. The monster evolved, its range of affection growing wider. Determined to protect his master's purity, Luo Sa steeled his resolve and slammed the rescue button. Simultaneously, most of the other players outside also chose to rescue their partners. With the rescue rate exceeding 90%, the room erupted in a blinding flash of light. The sudden brightness stung Luo Sa's eyes, forcing him to close them. The matchmaker's voice gently explained that this was the final test. In the next 10 seconds, players had to find their partners within the light to complete the trial of true heart. However, mistaking someone else for their partner would result in a penalty, an immediate binding marriage contract with the wrongly identified person. Luo Sa was surprised by the simplicity of the trial. He was confident he could recognize his master instantly. He reached out, grabbed someone, and confidently strode out of the trial area. The next moment, he froze. The man Luo Sa had let out was a short, elderly fellow, and the man let out by another player was his master, Hung. Confused as to how his master ended up with another woman, a system announcement declared that 6 players, including himself, had successfully found their partners and completed the trial. With the announcement, the little old man Luo Sa was holding transformed back into Hung with a poof. It turned out all the players' appearances had been randomly swapped. The true purpose of the trial was to test whether players could see through superficial appearances and recognize the essence of their partners. Only by knowing every detail about their partner could they succeed. Luo Sa had found Hung because he had observed everyone's reactions during the monster attack. His master, even with a changed appearance, wouldn't make such a bewildered expression. Only the grumpy little old man could be his master. Luo Sa could even recognize Hung through small, everyday details, allowing him to identify him quickly and accurately. The matchmaker confirmed this. This demonstrated that the players cared about their partner's inner selves, not their outward appearance. Their initial hesitation stemmed from not realizing how deeply they were already in love. Only when someone truly cared about another person would they notice and remember the small details of their lives. Luo Sa's heart had already been far more attentive to Hung than he realized. After hearing this analysis, Luo Sa looked at the man beside him again. The person he had always admired, both as his master and as Hung, was right here. With this realization, he accepted Heng's proposal. Seeing Luo Sa finally agree, Hung cleared his throat, feigning composure. He extended his hand and formally asked Luo Sa if he wanted to try the marriage system with him. Looking at Heng's serious expression, Luo Sa suddenly felt playful. He pretended to recoil from Heng's hand, teasingly claiming he refused to hold it because it was covered in drool. Heng's face fell, looking utterly crestfallen at the unexpected rejection. Seeing he seemed to have taken it seriously, Luo Sa quickly relented, playfully admitting he was just joking. Having traveled a long way for this fateful encounter, Luo Sa decided to accept Heng's confession. Seeing the look of stunned joy on his face, she calmly accepted the reality that her master was now her boyfriend. Just like that, the master and disciple seamlessly transitioned from their former roles into a couple, with their relationship now official. Heng's first act as Luosa's boyfriend was to shower her with gifts. He went to his friend Xiao Ilong's shop. He picked out a rare, out-of-print game cartridge for Luosa. As he was about to head to the counter to have it wrapped, a flamboyant, rich guy with an air of self-importance appeared before him. The rich guy, while paying for his own extravagant purchases, sneered at Heng's modest gift. Watching the obnoxious man stride away after paying, Heng felt a nagging sense of familiarity. Meanwhile, Luosa was awakened from a deep sleep by the insistent ringing of her doorbell. Assuming it was Heng with her gift, she opened the door to be greeted by a dazzling bouquet of roses. Before she could even utter a word, the scent of the roses triggered a violent sneeze. When she finally focused on the man holding the flowers, she froze. It was her ex-boyfriend, He Bufon. He Bufon announced that he had finished his business abroad and had returned specifically to win back her love. He proceeded to thrust the roses, along with several bags of luxury goods, into her arms. His presumptuous behavior infuriated Luosa. She couldn't believe her ex, whom she hadn't seen in 8 years, had the audacity to show up like this. Oblivious to her reaction, He Bufon condescendingly told her to stop acting like a child. Just as Luosa was reaching the limits of her patience, Heng arrived. He snatched the roses from Luosa, declaring that she was allergic to them, and tossed them into the trash. He then presented her with his own gift, the rare game cartridge. Luosa's eyes lit up. She was thrilled with the gift. He Bufon watched in disbelief as she disregarded the expensive gifts he had brought and fawned over a simple game cartridge. He convinced himself that Luosa was merely putting on an act with this poor boy and hung to spite him. Luosa, exasperated by his arrogance, told him that not everyone was impressed by luxury brands. She pointed out that even during their relationship, he had showered her with gifts but hadn't even bothered to remember that she was allergic to roses. He Bufon had always dismissed her anger as childishness. Fed up with his self-centered and stubborn personality, Luosa reminded him that they had broken up 8 years ago. She demanded that he leave her alone. He Bufon, however, interpreted her words in a completely different way. He took the fact that she remembered the exact date of their breakup as a sign of her undying love for him. Luosa, now beyond furious, threw him and his gifts out. Undeterred, He Bufon stood outside her door, plotting to investigate Heng. His research quickly revealed that Heng was the same person who had been getting close to Luosa online. He Bufon concluded that this was all an elaborate scheme concocted by Luosa to make him jealous. Heng was speechless at this delusional interpretation. Meanwhile, Luosa was anxiously waiting for the live model she had hired for her art class. 15 minutes had passed, and the model was still nowhere in sight. If this continued, she would have to resort to having the students pose for each other again. Hearing a commotion, Luosa called out, demanding to know what her students were doing. She then spotted Heng, hiding amongst the students, clutching a sketch pad and looking sheepish. Luosa was taken aback. She couldn't understand why he was in her class. Heng's good looks had already attracted the attention of the girls in the class, who were vying for his WeChat contact. Just as Heng was about to tell them he had a girlfriend, Luosa strode forward, grabbed his tie, and pulled him out of the classroom. She announced to her students that their model needed some private coaching and dragged Heng away. The students, witnessing this interaction, immediately started shipping them, even conjuring up images of Luosa and Heng in a passionate embrace. A mature, experienced teacher and a younger, energetic student. The students found the idea thrilling. The reality, however, was quite different, and Heng, having been dragged out of the classroom, huddled pathetically in a corner, watching Luosa pace back and forth in a fury. Heng explained that he had come to Luosa's classroom because he was afraid He Bufon would come to the school to harass him. Since his father was good friends with the principal of Luosa's school, he had already pulled some strings to smooth things over. Hearing this, Luosa simultaneously marveled at Heng's connections and complained that he hadn't given him any warning. Heng, however, felt equally wronged, pointing out that Luosa hadn't even bothered to introduce him to the class. This immediately diverted Luosa's attention. She declared that she simply wanted to avoid any embarrassing situations in front of her students. She absolutely wouldn't tolerate anything that disrupted class or the peace of the school. Just as she finished speaking, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. The door of the Art Class 2 classroom next door suddenly collapsed, and a shirtless man stumbled out. Both Luosa and Heng instantly recognized the half-naked figure. It was He Bufon, Luosa's arrogant ex frozen in place. They stared in disbelief at the unexpected interruption.